Shall we talk high intensity training? HIT.
Sure. So I don't know where you want to start, but first let's start with a very careful definition of terms, because these tend to get confused. HIT, high intensity training, refers to a category of resistance training that tends to revolve around training to failure. And we're going to go through sort of the history of it. It often is confused with high intensity interval training, HIIT.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure that like everybody knows what we're talking about. We're not talking about high intensity interval training. This is generally called high intensity training, although it's gone by different names over the years, right? I think HIT is probably a more modern term. I don't think you'll find that the earliest stages, it was ever called that specifically, but it's all referring to the same basic idea. I mean, if you want to be pedantic, and of course you do, and of course I do, weight training in and of itself is a type of interval training in that it is not done. It is done. You do a set, you take a rest. You know, continuous aerobic training is continuous because you do it continuously. It's right there in the name. Interval training, you were alternating hard intervals with easy intervals. In the strictest sense, resistance training is a type of interval training. The high intensity bit, like I said, high intensity training tends to refer to a specific subcategory, where really, I think, I would say in general, although we're going to look at an interesting exception down the road, tends to revolve around training to the point of concentric failure. And maybe we should, let's define that term later. We'll come
to
back
and beyond, but we'll come back to it.
Yes, exactly. So where do you want to start? I guess let's start at the beginning.
We'll start with the origins of it. Because as I understand, HIT was first developed by Arthur Jones. I want to ask what the fitness landscape, well, specifically the bodybuilding landscape, because all of this concerns bodybuilding, what it was like before he introduced HIT.
So it wouldn't surprise me if some of his ideas had not been at least tried prior to him really popularizing it. Right, like I guarantee, like if you look back at the earliest days of strength training, say from like the 1930s, right, when the original physical culture movement in the U.S. and all those old strongman and Heinburn and all those dudes, I guarantee you at some point someone tried something akin to what would later be called high intensity training. Right, I put up as one of my obnoxious moments on my Instagram the other year. I found some paper from like 1952, and it was like an analysis of modern bodybuilding principles. It's like a look at what people were doing at that point. And if you actually look at pictures of bodybuilders of those days, including Sean Connery, the picture, like he was originally a UK bodybuilder, they were not that much different in appearance than now. They weren't as conditioned, but in terms of muscle size, because genetics are genetics. And they described their training in terms of, sets, reps, and intensity. And some of them absolutely described doing as many reps as they could to failure. So I'm sure somebody prior to Arthur Jones had really done that. Now, to your point, what was going on in, the 60s into the 70s? And now I'm not a historian, but I know enough about it. The 70s was probably when a lot of the volume ideas were really starting to come into play. And that happened to just conveniently synchronize with the broad adoption of anabolic steroids. Now, it wasn't like they were new, right? Like D-ball was, I think, developed by Ziegler in the 50s. And I'm sorry, but anybody who thinks that those guys weren't using it is out of their mind. Like anybody thinks that bodybuilders waited for 20 years. And, there's a famous story. This is not bodybuilding related, but at the time, we had the whole thing with U.S. Olympic lifting. And the U.S. was starting to fall behind. And the guy that published Strength and Health, whose name I'm currently forgetting because my memory is going, like they did this, they're using isometric racks. And so we had a group of guys use isometric racks where you just do, pushing and pulling against a fixed object with this new drug called Dianabol. And everybody made huge gains. And so he used those gains to sell isometric racks in Strength and Health magazine as the future of Olympic lifting. All you needed to do was push and pull. Well, I don't think it was deliberate. Nobody at the time really realized that, what an effect the drugs had. I mean, I realized that according to, drugs only help a little, but yeah, whatever. we're not going to go walk down that road because someone might go get pissy about me on Reddit again. But I don't know that it was a deliberate choice, but somehow that got left out of the story that they were taking, 10 milligrams of D-ball a day.
Yeah, you can almost pinpoint that development of D-ball, or rather its impact on the bodybuilding world in just the physiques.
Right.
Like if you look at Bill Pearl, for instance,
that's the perfect example.
Just blows up out of nowhere.
Suddenly, within a year, he's 40 pounds heavier. So either he, maybe he was doing 45 to 52 sets a week. Maybe he'd figured out even then what Brad Schoenfeld wouldn't figure out for 40 more years. Or there's probably, let's call it Occam's anabolic, right? Like probably the simplest steroid answer is the correct one. So anybody, and that's why when I used to get into arguments with people about the whole FFMI thing, and they'd be like, well, back in the 50s and 60s, guys had FMIs. Like, if you really don't think that they were using drugs as soon as they were around, you're out of your mind. There's no question that on some level, those athletes were going to experiment with them. I mean, Ziegler's whole point with D-ball was to create an anabolic steroid that had more anabolic effects and less androgenic effects than testosterone. Like, that was discovered in like the 30s. And I doubt it was used heavily for reasons, but that was Ziegler's whole purpose, was to make a safer anabolic steroid with more tissue building and less masculinizing effects. So I guarantee they were using them. But I think by the 70s, I mean, that's about when Arnold was really, that was kind of when things shifted. You look back at the history of strength training, and it was all fairly basic stuff. A lot of 5x5s, which I still maintain is that. If we had 6 fingers, we would have done 6x6. And I random side note, just because I believe in these. It's interesting how humans fixate on 5x5. When I was speed skating, my coach had known some guys when he was competing that decided for one training cycle, they were going to go to training, warm up. They were going to do 5 sets of 5 laps as hard as they could, figuring that it would give them a combination of speed and endurance. 5x5 is just a human universal for whatever dumb. Again, this is why. It's because we can jazz hands. Although, if you actually go back and read Bill Pearl's book, the reason he did 5x5, there's an old study by AFA on strength that concluded that 4 to 6 sets of 4 to 6 reps were optimal for strength. Now, Bill Starr was working with football players, American football players, and that would be too hard for them to remember. So he just said 5x5. 4 to 6 sets of 4 to 6.
Is that in The Strongest Shall Survive?
Yes, which is still a really excellent book. So anyway, but you look back and they basically did, and the focus is on progression, focuses on getting stronger, because it all came out of that physical culture movement. Bodybuilding really, as a separate activity, wasn't so much of a thing. Like, I'm sure they experimented with a lot of different things, but early on, it was very, full body, 3 times a week. I'm sure they did some basic split routines, but it was like, the logic was, well, if you can squat 405 by 5, you're not going to have small legs. Because somehow guys in the 50s knew what people in 2025 have forgotten. The progressive overload is the key to long-term growth. So
we'll come back to that.
Yeah, I think that was sort of the landscape. And of course, this is when, really the 70s. if people get bored, I wrote this 80-part article on my website a bunch of years ago called Why the U.S. Sucks at Olympic Lifting, where I just went off the rails and I got into a socioeconomic analysis of the United States versus other countries to lead into what happened in bodybuilding and in strength training and Olympic lifting. Because in the 70s, there were kind of like 3 big developments that killed Olympic lifting in the United States. And they were the rise of powerlifting as a separate sport. That's when it started to become formalized from the odd lifts. And the reality was that the Olympic lifts are hard to learn. You can teach anyone a bench press in a day. Like, it may take you 10 years to perfect your snatch, but powerlifting was simpler and let Americans do what they like to do, which was move big weights. So that was number 1. Number 2 was the rise of the Terminator. That's when Arnold started to really come to prevalence. And that was really when all those volume ideas in the Weider magazines started to become a thing. Doing 20 sets per muscle group, and one muscle group, every muscle group once a week, and a lot of those split routines. That became a thing. It also became a thing in the sense of when Arnold would eventually do Conan, and I'd have to go back and look at what year that came out, right? He very much normalized bodybuilding. Because prior to that, bodybuilding was seen as an activity. Again, you have to keep this in social context of 1960s United States America. Real sports, football, baseball, basketball, golf. The idea of putting on posing trunks, oiling up, and foofing about on stage was not seen as the most manly of all activities. I'll just put it that way, but you know what I mean.
There's a famous clip of Arnold defending bodybuilding from home accusations that it's a gay activity.
And there are a lot of preconceptions. Some people even think that if you are involved in your body, that you are homosexual, you know, because it's something very bad to be involved in your own body. It's good for the female, but not good for the man, which is stupid, you know.
Right, but that's how it was seen. And then you go look at how they used to do manual calf raises with two dudes sitting on your back and go, There's actually a great podcast. I will not be able to find it. And it was basically explaining how even in the early 20th century, gyms were a safe space for basically people in the gay and lesbian community. I mean, people don't realize, okay, those early muscle magazines, that was safe gay porn. And that's not a joke. And I'm not saying this to be, I'm not like being critical. Like I'm not, it just, this was a way, because if you look at those magazines, there's very little training information and there's a lot of buff dudes in fig leaves. And Weider and all those early magazines, that was a way of disseminating what would have been gay porn to men. Again, this is not a joke. This is in the history. So anyway, but by the 70s, Arnold legitimized bodybuilding as a sport for men because it had to do with Conan the Barbarian. So that was the second development in the 70s. And that's when training styles really started to change.
I believe Conan was 82.
Well, then it would have been Pumping Iron.
Yep.
Okay. But it was still in that, but that's what training was of that era. And a lot of that was because of the Weider magazines, right? Arnold was the face of Weider at the time. And Weider had all the Weider training principles and pumping and blitzing and bombing and all that stuff. That was sort of the style of training at the time. And of course, whatever the top guys are doing, that's how you're supposed to train. What was left out was the anabolics. But then the other big development, and this brings us into our topic, is what I put in my article series, was the rise of the machines. Because up until that point, most weight training was still barbell oriented, early cable machines, there's all those great old movies of guys, doing the cable stacks up against the wall. Like there was rudimentary stuff, but that's when Arthur Jones introduced Nautilus. And that was really the first major line of equipment that was meant to be superior to barbells. And certainly that was Jones's, he invented the things and he did it for very specific reasons, having to do with cams and physics and biomechanics. And in 1970, he released what's called Nautilus Bulletin 1, which was like his first booklet. Now, you can go back and look. Arthur Jones was, we'll call him an iconoclast because that's about and that's putting it mildly. He was not soft-spoken. He did not pull punches. There are endless stories. He had his little Nautilus compound down in Florida with alligators and he'd pull guns on people. Like he was definitely a character. But if you go read Nautilus Bulletin 1, even 50 years later, a lot of it holds up. A lot of his ideas that he was not drilling and drawing. Now, was he right about everything? Of course not. Nobody's right about everything.
What would you say some of his most controversial or revolutionary claims were?
Well, so far as he was one of the ones that was talking about, in terms of muscular involvement, the idea of pre-exhausting, that if you're doing a compound movement and a limiting muscle is not the target, and using a lot of pre-exhaustion ideas and looking at the biomechanics of movements and looking at the physics of what was going on and talking about how in a barbell curl, at the initial part of the movement, there is zero resistance that peaks in the middle. And a lot of what Nautilus was doing was with the cam, was to alter the mechanics throughout the range of motion to get a more even stimulus from beginning to end. And a lot
just
of
in case it's unclear, Arthur Jones pioneered the Nautilus machines.
Now, I think if you go back, actually someone in 1910, there's a patent for a cam-shaped, a Nautilus-shaped cam for exercise, because that's always the case. But he was the one that really was the first to take it and make it into a commercial line of equipment. and promote it as being actually superior to barbell exercise. And I think certainly at that time, when people were still very much locked into, barbell training ideas. Although, I mean, if you look, as again, one of my side rants, and we need to do another complete video called F the Big Five, right? This macho attachment to these big movements as the best for muscle building or whatever. It's like, look, people don't realize that in the early part of this game, the reason people did squat and bench and deadlifts and overhead press, that's all there was to do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, back in the day, you had to rock a bar onto your back to do squats, right?
Yeah, the Steinborn squat.
Yeah, which every once in a while someone tries to bring back into popularity. Like, look, forgotten exercises were forgotten for a reason, right? But it's like, fine, well, if you're going to be that macho and hew to the old ways, then you need to get two people lift the bar up onto your shoulders. Squat racks are for babies, obviously, right? But even then, they were trying to design better ways to train. And
yeah, not to prolong this side rant too much, but I find it funny how there are so many people who argue that squat, bench, deadlift, these big compound lifts with barbells are the best for muscle growth. Everyone, all of these same people readily accept that you should never do Bosu ball squats. Reason being, they're unstable.
Sure.
So they admit of this continuum where the more stable an exercise is, the more hypertrophic it is. So then why wouldn't machines, which are more stable than barbells, be more hypertrophic?
Because machines are for babies. And I'm going to try to
Apparently
curse less so
so.
you don't have to beat me as much. It's a matter of they draw the line exactly so that they're on the correct side of it. There is no rationality to it.
It seems to me that there is no rationality.
No, there isn't. People draw that vague line in the sand to include that what they do is correct and what anybody else does is wrong. That's just how human brains work. We talked about that in the GLP-1 thing. People do this in all regards. But yes, if you take that to its logical end extreme, if the more stable, the better it is for hypertrophy. Now, people are going to hear this and go, usually they're just like, Lyle sucks at squats. No, I was pretty good at squats. I competed as a powerlifter. I've trained powerlifters, right? Like, you have to do those movements as part of the competition. I'm not anti-squat. I'm not anti-deadlift. I'm not anti-bench press. But if you want to take the argument that the more stable a movement, the better it is to train the muscle for hypertrophy, then machines are the logical end result of that. But more than that, in 2025, can you think of another area that has simply decided that new technologies are somehow still inferior to what we were doing 100 years ago? Name
politics.
One. Okay, name two. That was on me. The bar was too low. No, I mean, like, okay, why use calculators? Why use it? Why not? Why are we not still using Morse code? Cell phones are for babies. Real men use Morse code. Real men use slide rules. In every other area, we will readily accept new, efficient, better technologies. Except this one. It's fascinating for me. Now, without getting into all that, because that's a whole separate thing, for some people, those big movements do work. If you have very specific biomechanics, Olympic lifters obviously can get big quads out of squatting, although here's the interesting thing. The Chinese Olympic lifters, you know how they build muscle? They do bodybuilding work on machines because they know that Olympic lifting is crap for muscle growth. That squatting, you can, like, are you going to do 10 sets of 10 squats and not be exhausted? No, but you can do 8 sets of 10 leg extensions and get the same stimulus. They do bodybuilding stuff for their muscles, and that usually means isolation movements, which that's a whole separate thing. There's a great argument. We'll have another podcast on this. As I've said this, I could take a ranked beginner and I could get them as big as they'll ever get with nothing but isolation movements. Because that is also the logical extreme of, if you're doing a compound exercise, any muscle that limits your ability to take, any muscle that fails that's not the target muscle, or any exercise where a non-target muscle fails first, is bad for that muscle. That's why people with long arms don't get a big chest out of bed. People with short arms do, because their chest is what fatigues. And people with long arms don't. And if you take all that compound nonsense out, if I have someone do a pec deck, if I have someone bench press to failure, or do a chest press to failure, and if their triceps fail, do I know that their chest got a stimulus? No, maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I don't know. If I had them do a pec deck to failure, I know what got trained. And what's interesting, there's a video, I put it on my Facebook book, or let's see if I can find it, of Arthur Jones. He basically felt all exercise science was absolute crap. And Like I said, he wasn't drilling a dry well. But even at the time, to test strength, they would do bench press. And he goes, if I want to test somebody's strength, why would I have them do a bench press? I don't want to test their skill. If I want to test their muscle strength, I put them on a machine. And he explained that, you know, if there's 100 pounds of force on the machine required, if you can do more than 100, it will move. If you can do 100, it will be static. If you can do less with 100, it will come down. He goes, I'm not testing skill. I'm testing strength. And 50 years later, he's right. They are still testing 1RM in beginners on back squats, please, and taking people to failure. Well, squats are a common part of most exercise programs. Who cares? You're going to tell me that the average moderately trained college kid can take a squat anywhere close to limits? Spare me. Put them on a leg press. Take off. If you want to test volume, take the skill component. You're not. You're testing their skill. He was saying that 50 years ago, and he was right. So he sort of, but even prior to that, if you look at even Nautilus Bulletin 1, it was based around barbell movements. Because again, that's what they had. But what his big, I think, argument was that intensity, not volume, that the difficulty of the exercise, not the amount of exercise, was the stimulus to growth. And if you go read Nautilus Bulletin 1, which is online in terrible format, somebody scanned the PDF, but it's on individual pages rather than one file. It's terrible. His basic idea, it had to do with muscle fiber recruitment. And his belief, and this is incorrect, we know that this is incorrect right now, it was that, you know, during the first repetitions of a set where it's submaximal, you're not getting full fiber recruitment. And that it's not until you do as many reps as possible that you will actually, and even then he said you can't recruit all muscle fibers. That's probably not true, but that you will recruit the most possible by taking a set, as many reps as you can, and then maybe another one if you can get it. Right? Like that was his basic idea. And he had, again, some of his arguments were logical. One of them, I looked back earlier today, it was like, if you look at, you know, people who work construction, it's the arm that's doing the harder work that's bigger than the one that's doing again, he didn't believe in much exercise science. And certainly at the time, there wasn't much there. They were still studying mostly aerobic stuff. So I don't disagree. But his basic idea was the growth stimulus comes from the intensity, not from doing more. And he was on record as saying, you know, that there should be no reason, assuming you go to true limit failure, to do that 2 sets of an exercise should be enough. And there'd be no reason to do a third one. And I don't know if I agree with that steadfastly, but this was the basic idea. Now, this is also in the context of a 3 times a week full body workout. There was frequently more than one exercise per muscle group. And if you add it up, if you assume 2 to 3 sets to failure across those, you end up with like 6 to 9 sets per muscle group per week to limit failure. And I'd say for most people, that would get them farther than effing about for 52 sets a week, or rather pissing about for 52 sets a week, because it would actually be a stimulus and we can get it. I'm not going to math out the effective reps, but it's like, yeah, would have, you know, because he also mentioned that it was funny. He understood the intensity volume thing better than people now. And he said, if you're going to do a high volume of exercise, you won't be able to do it intensely enough. He said, but if you're doing it at that intensity, if you were to do a large amount of exercise, it would exhaust you, because there's an inverse relationship that people in 2025 and supposed professional fitness industry have forgotten, that there is that relation also with frequency. So his basic routine, like I said, 3 times a week, full body, somewhere between 6 to 9 true sets to failure. I mean, till it won't move at all, like true concentric muscular failure. Tried to find in the video and article series I did so many years ago as being unable to complete a concentric repetition despite applying maximum force. It's not quitting because you got tired, or because it got too hard, or because you need to go set up your camera and throw up for people so they'll think you're tough.
Yeah, or technical failure. You're talking about physiological muscular failure.
Right, because again, and that's also with the machine stuff, right? Like that takes the technical failure. You know, I'm sorry, worrying about technical failure on, say, a seated leg curl is moronic. Just as a hypothetical example that has nothing to do with anything. By the way, coupon code Mike has no tan still valid for anybody that wants to use it. So
go check out the link in the description to Lyle's books.
That was his basic. Like I said, the Nautilus Bulletin one has a lot more than that. And I'm not trying to summarize everything he said, but his basic premise was that intensity was more important, big picture, than volume. And it was somewhat, I think, of a reaction to, again, the volume work of the day. Now, certainly the volume work of the day works when you're on anabolics. There's no doubt about it. And I think it's interesting, even if you look, at what Arnold and those guys were doing, go look at some of the videos. They didn't do grinding reps, but their work sets were usually, you could tell that, they used to call them the growth reps. They went till it slowed. Like, there's some videos out there, and it's not grinding.
Yeah, go look at Ed Corney squatting.
Yeah, exactly. They're certainly not doing the pansy ass stuff that he who shall not be named is doing and pretending as hard as he screams through an 8 reps. Like, they were training hard. They were just doing a lot more sets. Although I actually would question, I think if you look at some of that, 5 exercises, 4 to 5 sets, the first 2 or 3 were warm-ups anyway. Like, I think if you actually look at their volumes, they aren't nearly what people think they were. They certainly weren't doing 20 work sets. That's for damn sure.
And hence, you should train more than the pros.
Well, obviously. So that was his basic idea. Yeah, so that was his basic idea, which again, he had some very unique machines. First gym I trained at had them, and I've had a personal bias against Nautilus ever since then for what you will understand as being a completely rational reason, which is that since I have like long arms and short legs, a lot of those machines didn't fit me well, and I felt very personally attacked by the fact that they weren't suitable for my biomechanics. And like I said, totally rational reason for disliking them. The Cybex that came later were much more adjustable, so I like that line better because they fit me better. I'm being somewhat facetious. I had this weird, it's an emotional thing. It's just like, well, these machines don't fit me. F Nautilus. But he had some really good designs, and he had a lot of stuff with some of the early pre-exhaust. Like he had one machine that you'll never see again that was a combination pec deck chest press. So you would pec deck to failure and go immediately into a chest press to get maximal chest stimulation by pre-fatiguing, like some really cool machines really early on. And, I'm sure they weren't all great. The MedX that came much later had some good machines and some terrible machines. That was the basis. And I don't think he ever called it high intensity training. Certainly not that I'm aware of.
Arthur Jones.
Yeah. To my knowledge, he never did. He never called it that. It was simply, I think to him, it was just proper training. And
I wonder if he gave it a name in the Colorado experiment that he did with Casey Viator.
Yeah, I don't know, honestly, if he ever actually named it. I don't recall, like I said, I didn't read Nautilus Bulletin 1 start to finish in detail, but I don't recall him ever actually giving it a specific name. I do think that came later, and if I'm wrong, somebody can feel free to send me an ugly email about how I don't know what I'm talking about. Because again, I just don't remember the history of it that well.
Do you want to talk about the Colorado experiment now or later potentially?
Yeah,
because that really was ridiculous.
Yes, it really was ridiculous. So the Colorado experiment, as I remember it, was a 6-week thing. They took Casey Viator, who was basically detrained and out of shape, and
a really good.
Yeah, he was
wasn't
really
he Mr. USA?
I don't know. Probably, and I'll take your word. You can look it up. And basically put him through 6 weeks of hands-on training, where he pushed him
AAU Mr. America, youngest ever,
to just inhuman lengths, right? Like one of Arthur Jones's, like one of his favorite workouts, where you see this in some of his later, right? It's not a Nautilus Bulletin 1. Leg extension to failure, straight to leg press to failure, straight to back squat to failure. Good luck. But it was Arthur overseeing it and pushing it to that. And over a 6-week span, he regained like 36 pounds of muscle and it was something just stupid. And make no mistake, it was a guy who'd been big, who had lost a bunch of muscle. I forget if he was sick or injured or whatever it was. He was certainly regaining that. And I think it tends to misrepresent a little bit the results. But it just points out, like Arthur Jones's whole thing was like, it points out what, 6 weeks of overseen intense training. Because I do believe somewhere I read that like Viator didn't continue training that way after he left the Arthur Jones compound, because he simply wasn't able to generate that level of intensity on his own. Don't swear me to that either. I read a bunch of stuff last week, and some of it kind of garbled together.
Said he made those gains from 14 brief workouts spread over 4 weeks.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And he gained 63.21 pounds in that time. Actually, it says he increased his muscle mass by 63.21 pounds, which is an even bolder claim.
Yeah, that's because like in the 1970s, I will give them a pass for not knowing the difference between lean body mass and skeletal muscle mass. In 2025, I will not. Right? They didn't know. They didn't know from that distinction. They didn't know nothing about nothing in the 70s. I'll give them a pass. I won't.
He gained a lot of muscle, no doubt, but
no,
63 be
but
incredible.
He was regaining a lot of what he had lost. And
undoubtedly,
that happened.
He was great before the experiment, detrained.
Well,
and then we know from muscle memory, you just
Was he also going back on anabolics? I mean, Arthur Jones was steadfastly against anabolics, but that doesn't mean they weren't being used. But we won't ever know. And that's a single case study in a great bodybuilder who was detrained. That doesn't, has it ever been replicated? Of course not. Was it an actual scientific experiment? Of course not. It was just kind of to make the point that obviously he didn't need to be in the gym 2 hours a day, 6 days a week to make those gains.
Or regains.
In any case, right? And it's hilarious. You go back and look at that, and people were the anti-Nautilus people, which is basically everybody else, because they didn't like Arthur Jones.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. The backlash and skepticism that Arthur Jones faced.
They were making claims. They're like, oh no, Viator actually snuck out and went to another gym and got an extra workout. So I'm like, you can claim whatever the hell you want, but how about some evidence? No, we don't need evidence. We just need, to make up stuff. I mean, these are the same people who would eventually start the NSCA and who would eventually lie about CrossFit. So, they already had a history of making stuff up about
CrossFit.
Oh, did you not hear about that? Oh,
you
4 or 5 years.
You got to inform me.
4 or 5 years. The NSCA, National Strength and Conditioning Association, which was an attempt by a bunch of Olympic lifting coaches to legitimize what they did. They published a paper in the journal claiming that CrossFit caused all these injuries, and they made the data up from whole cloth. And CrossFit sued the shit out of them and won. Go Google it.
That's incredible.
CrossFit, yeah, they literally made the data up.
That's hilarious because there are so many legitimate reasons to criticize CrossFit, and they had to lie.
Yes, they just created fake data to misrepresent it, and CrossFit took them to court and won. So that's the state of the NSCA right now. There's all kinds of articles about it.
Yeah, you're right. They were locked in a legal battle. National Casualty sued the NSCA.
Yep, fantastic stuff.
CrossFit Inc. Sued the NSCA.
Yep.
Yeah, and they won.
Yep, fantastic stuff. So it was the same people then, the strength coaches, and that would eventually probably found the NSCA. They didn't, because I used to be NSCA certified, and the NSCA, as I like to call it, they believe in the 3 Ps: power cleans, plyometrics, and periodization. Everything you read from them, that's what everyone should do power cleans. For athletes, but then they have a personal training certification, and it's the same thing. Like, yeah, I'm going to have a Gen Pop person doing power cleans and plyometrics and periodizing training when they barely show up. Sure. It's just them justifying their personal biases. Regardless, back to Colorado experiment. So there are all kinds of lies and claims and this and that and the other, because there always are. I'm sure Fred Hatfield didn't like, he and Arthur Jones, I think, tied it up, because Hatfield was a volume Russian guy. And, here comes Arthur Jones being like, yep, you only need a little bit of volume. And a lot of people claimed that, his machines are very popular in gyms, because his whole thing was like, look, you can run a Nautilus circuit in 30 minutes and do that 2 or 3 times a week, because they just have the machines in a row, and you would just go boom, 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 and you were done. Which, you know what, for Gen Pop, that'd be perfectly fine. People would get much further doing that than me watching them piss about for 2 hours and get nothing done. So yeah, and they're like, oh, he's got commercial interests and he's just trying to sell a line of machines and blah, 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 blah. Just the same old thing you always hear. Because of course they didn't have anything to sell. Of course not. it's only when the other guy is trying to make a living.
So,
what's that? Yeah.
Never mind.
Yes, no, I heard you. Poor Queequeg. Exactly. So that was, like I said, that was the basics of Nautilus. And I'm sure like I said, I'm not a full historian. I only skimmed. There's 3 Nautilus bulletins, although they're pretty similar in scope. But that was the basic idea. You don't need to do more training. You need to do harder training. But still with relatively moderate volumes. Like if you look at, and this is what we're going to get into as we look at the history of this. If you look at Arthur Jones's original message, it's pretty damn rational, right? Don't do a ton of work, do harder work, but do a moderate amount of it. So if the average person did 6 to 9 truly limit sets per week, guarantee you they would get further. He also, of course, believed in progressive overload. He once made a statement, by the time the average man can barbell curl 200 pounds, his arms will be as big as they need to be for any activity short of wrestling a bear. That was it. He believed in intensity, progressive overload. Everything else was aimed at making exercise and training more efficient with the cams, to keep the resistance curve, more even throughout the movement so that it wasn't too easy at the start, hard in the middle, easy at the top, or whatever he really pioneered the cam idea, which I dare say all modern machines use in one form or another. There's occasionally different ways to try to get it done, but the idea is the same. Is to get the resistance to change throughout the movement so that the loading is more even throughout. Now, maybe that doesn't matter for sports, but I mean, hell, what did Louis Simmons introduce? Chains as accommodating resistance. Squats get easier at the top, so we use chains and bands to make it harder where you're stronger, because you get more even strength. I mean, yeah, that was to optimize the gear too. But Arthur Jones was really the first one bringing all this to the forefront.
To your knowledge, I know you briefly touched on this, but were there any predecessors to Arthur Jones's style of HIT?
I don't know offhand. Like I said, I'm sure at some point Grimmick did it. Grimmick did everything at one point or
right,
another.
That guy.
Like that's kind of
bodybuilder.
An old set. Yeah, he was an early. Well, I realized that in the early 20th century there was no such thing. You did strength training. If you got bigger as a consequence of it. You trained for function and strength. They did gymnastics. They did hand balancing. There wasn't really bodybuilding in the way we think of it today. You simply trained hard to get stronger in the equipment you had available. That as a formalized separate activity, I want to say started in like the 60s. I looked it up once, like when the first bodybuilding show was, and it might have been as early as the 50s. Like there are stories, Tommy Kono, who was one of the all-time great U.S. Olympic lifters, both the offseason he would train for he would just train for general strength and aesthetics and bodybuilding. And then 6 weeks before competition, he would throw in the Olympic lifts and remind himself how to do it. And since there was no competition, he could get away with that. But like bodybuilding is a formal activity. You trained to get strong and you got big as a secondary consequence of that.
I think Sandow actually organized the first bodybuilding show in the Royal Albert Hall in London.
Well,
great competition.
Yeah, I looked it up too. So whatever, that's the UK doesn't count. We're talking about America. We're talking about the only country that matters. And I think here it was probably a bit, I mean, it might have been going on, but like I said, it wasn't the way we think of it as these being these very distinct sports. Just wasn't a thing then. You just trained for strength and you got bigger as a consequence. It was more of an effect than a goal. That came later. So I think that would really in the 60s and 70s where people were starting to become distinct activities.
Yeah, explicitly training for the look.
Right, where Olympic lifting was its own thing, although even then Olympic lifters were still, U.S. Olympic lifters were in the mindset of you get strong. This is what Americans like to do. We were good at the clean and jerk. We were good at the clean and press. We were crappy at the snatch because that's like doing ballet with the barbell, and that doesn't appeal to coarse American minds. No, I'm not making that up. This is something that was told to me by, oh crap, I've now forgotten his name. Olympic lifting coach. He passed away a bunch of years ago. I'll look up his name. But yeah, and then when they eliminated the press, the U.S. could only do okay at one event, and they were still training old school. Just get strong in the gym. big squat, big deadlift, big overhead press, and then F around on the Olympic lifts and hope for the best. Meanwhile, the Russians and Eastern Europeans were approaching Olympic lifting as the Olympic lifting and from a completely different standpoint. Americans came to Olympic lifting from strength training. The Europeans are like, we're going to examine Olympic lifting in its own right. So that was about, so, you had the odd lifts, the strongman stuff, strength, and then bodybuilding was becoming its own thing. But I think in the 70s was where it really splintered. Olympic lifting was dead in the US because of Arnold. Bodybuilding, again, especially the coarse American mind. Okay, I can spend 10 years learning how to do this super complicated movement and get my ass handed to me by someone whose name I can't pronounce. Because even then, Americans were looking at the Eastern Europeans, who were often very lightly muscled, and they're like, how can these guys be strength athletes? I mean, they're not big, because Olympic lifting wasn't about that, right? So you had that, so you could get into the strong lifts or the odd lifts, which powerlifting came out of that, but I'm like, that takes hard work. Or you just go pump it up and take a supplement and get big. That very much appealed to the American mindset of quick results now. Creatine? Why people love creatine? 7 pounds lean body mass in a week. Damn, that's awesome. Or I could spend a year trying to improve my bench press, or a decade trying to learn a movement that is hard. So that was really, and that's where I think, again, when it became legitimized by Arnold, especially as an activity, a manly activity instead of a less than manly activity, that's when we really saw the split. And then Jones was only approaching it from a hypertrophy standpoint. He didn't give a shit about the other sports. Like I said, he's like, I don't want to test skill. I want to test maximal strength. And a machine will do that better than a barbell. Of course it will. That's just, and again, 50 years later, I've been saying that too. We still haven't learned it. So yeah, that was Jones' basic idea. And I'm sure there was backlash. I'm sure people wrote all kinds of hate because it just went Weider-controlled bodybuilding at that point. The AAU was gone by then, I believe. Right? The AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, used to control bodybuilding. And they had height classes, and you had to do the clean and jerk as part of the competition.
Yeah.
Then Weider took it over, made it the IFBB, dropped the clean and press, introduced weight classes, but he had magazines and supplements to sell. He couldn't have someone saying that Arnold's way of training was wrong. Arnold was his mouthpiece and was the face of Weider bodybuilding. So for Jones to come along, I'm quite sure if you look back into the history of, Muscle and Fitness in the 70s or whatever Weider was publishing, I guarantee you there were hit pieces on Arthur Jones. I guarantee it.
And Arthur Jones did have some contemporaries like what was his name? Ellington Darden?
I think Darden came a little bit later, but he certainly was like a protege. Because I remember, Ellington Darden has written the same book 60 times because I've read a couple of them. I actually don't know what. Well, he looks. I'm seeing 1996. Like, he's been around for a while, but I think he was not so much a contemporary of Jones as kind of a student and sort of continued down that path. But I think really the next big step in the evolution would have been Mike Mentzer.
Mike Mentzer.
So I think that's really where the next step in sort of the evolution of the idea, simply because Mentzer was unique. So I tried to get sort of a feel for, how all that happened. I had to go to the Wikipedia here. Hi, buddy. Mentzer was one of those guys that was, even as a young bodybuilder, he was good. He had good genetics. The fact that his brother Ray was also a successful bodybuilder, like, genetics were there, but that didn't make the training any less valuable. So I guess, and a lot of what I'm going to say, there's a YouTube channel that someone in my Facebook group pointed me to. A guy named calls himself Mr. America Hart, and I guess he trained with Mentzer. So frequently with this stuff, it's very hard to tell like what's real and what's not, because there's so much propaganda. Like what's written in the muscle magazines is frequently gibberish. There are so many people that have written hit pieces on it. Like, it can be very difficult. But this guy actually did a video I'll give you the link to called, HIT Legends and Gym Myths, where he addresses some of the myths and legends about Mentzer, many of which that were not myths, but we'll get to that. So as far as I can tell, basically, or what this guy claims or states, Mentzer used very traditional training as he built up in his initial days as a bodybuilder. Won a bunch of competitions and then suffered a shoulder injury. Now, Mr. America Hart claims it was due to the volume training. He says that Mike talks about it in The Wisdom of Mike Mentzer. I found a copy. I couldn't find a word about that in there. Neither here nor there. Seems to be accepted that he had a shoulder injury. And I guess that's when he met Casey Viator, who we already just talked about, who pointed him in the direction of Arthur Jones. And so this would have been, the mid-70s. And apparently, following Jonesian principles, he won the Mr. America in 76 and would continue that. And then, his career sort of came to an end in 1980 when the Olympia, which he believes was fixed, and he never got over it. So that was the end, but there was that middle period. And the training he was claiming to do at the time was very low volume, frequently like 2 sets per muscle group, but like a superset, where he would claim that for lats, once a week, he would do pull over to concentric failure and then pull downs to failure, and that was it. Like he had a very sort of basic split routine 3 times a week, alternating, I think, legs and upper body. I looked it up in his book and I didn't write it down, and it doesn't matter, but it was very low volume. Now,
just to illustrate something to the viewer or listener, Mike Mentzer placed 5th at the 1980 Mr. Olympia behind Arnold Schwarzenegger, who placed first, then Chris Dickerson, Frank Zane, and Boyer Coe. Yeah. And many argue that it was a robbery, as in Arnold didn't deserve to win, but won nonetheless. Or rather, the victory was robbed from Mentzer. Mike Mentzer should have placed higher, many argue.
Right. So the Wikipedia page, for whatever this is worth, although I find that with the people, having editing wars, that apparently Mentzer didn't think he should have won so much as he didn't think that Arnold shouldn't have won. Right. The idea, because there was a conflict of interest. Weider ran the IFBB. Weider owned Muscle and Fitness. Arnold was a Weider-sponsored athlete who was the face of Muscle and Fitness. I'm not saying it was or it was not rigged. However, there is a major conflict of interest there when the Fox is watching the hen house in terms of who's judging. Regardless, Mentzer never got over that. And that's when he quit competing. And honestly, I don't know that contributed. Probably didn't help with some of his later mental health issues, but we'll also talk about that. Not in a critical way, just like it is what it is. But during that time, he had adopted, Jonesian principles. And one thing this YouTube guy said is that the workouts he wrote about that he was doing, the very low volume, high intensity training, that was going into competition. Apparently in the off season, when he mentioned he could not generate sufficient intensity, he would do 4 workouts a week, upper lower split. Now his volume was probably very low, even at the time, but it was not what he made it sound like, certainly. And this ties into the fact that there were rumors that are not rumors. Heavy amphetamine use to generate the levels of intensity that he was known for. But there's kind of this issue, if you get too deep into it, that much of what he was writing about training, he never actually did. Like, that's not how he actually trained. And again, I'm reporting what a guy who says he trained with Mike personally, like this, trying to avoid hearsay, but especially what came in his later books. So, but that was the basic gist of it, right? And he took Arthur Jones's principles. He did feel that Arthur was even still recommending too high of a frequency and too many sets. But I also think you have to take into consideration, Arthur wasn't writing for pro bodybuilders, right? We're talking about the general public here. By the time someone is getting very, very strong and is able to generate more intensity, it may very well be, right? We know that as intensity goes up, volume. What have I been saying for 2 decades? As you get more advanced, you need less training, whether you're a pro or not. Mike has no 10% off all of my books, right? So in a sense, Mentzer took that to its logical extreme. Now, of course, you have to take into account anabolic steroids. he already had the physique. He was already well developed, right? Like you look at him pre-Arthur Jones, like he was already big. He just became a bigger version of himself. And we can say the same about the volume training. Was the training, was the drugs, was it both? I mean, if nothing else, he wasn't spending 12 hours a day in the gym or 12 hours a week in the gym doing very short, very intense workouts on fairly specialized equipment. Well, I said in the off season what he was, and what's interesting, so I found this book. Where the hell did I just put it? Oh, came across this book, Heavy Duty for Women. I actually found it. It was tucked into a different. I bought Arnold's Body Shaping for Women because I found it at the half price books, and it was just tucked inside. This is such a find. Like, just it even came with a workout card.
Wow.
And it's basically a bunch of introduction into very simple training. And I'm just going to kind of run through this because it shows you like early HIT and what it became, and even modern training are not as different as you think. Okay, so the beginner workout, basically full body, one exercise per muscle group, one set of 10 reps. And actually, Arthur Jones recommended first week to do that 5 days in a row. You're a beginner. It's to practice the movements. It's to avoid soreness or whatever. And then for like the next 6 months, 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you go to 2 sets to failure. Okay, for a beginner routine, that's perfectly legitimate. Like, that's basically what I would put a beginner on. I might have, 2 sets to true limit failure, might be 3 sets if it's pyramiding up, like whatever. The principles are the same. And then heavy duty training for intermediate and advanced. The intermediate was like an upper lower 4 days a week. Oh yeah, the workout. Monday and Thursday, legs, chest, triceps. Tuesday, Friday, lats, traps, delts, biceps. Just a basic split routine. 4 days a week, still. So like, for example, the leg workout. Leg extension straight into leg presses, right? So that's 2, pre-exhaust set, that's 2, and then a set of squats. Okay, that's 3 sets to true limit failure done twice a week. It's on the lower end of things, but again, if it's true limit sets, chest, dumbbell flies to incline press, but 2 cycles of that. So 4 sets of chest twice a week, that's 8 sets to true limit failure. That's not inconsistent with what we know would be effective for an intermediate. And then at the advanced level, he talks about pre-exhaustion, forced repetitions, negatives, basically increasing intensity rather than volume as you get to higher levels. So like, it was fairly reasonable. Like, again,
does the volume climb as you reach those higher levels, or no?
No, if anything, I think it goes
good.
down. He doesn't really give a lot of examples of the workout. It's just like, oh, for more advanced, you start including pre-exhaustion and forced repetitions. But no, it's the goal is not to increase the volume. It's to just keep pushing up the weights and progressing that way. Now, this was, again, I don't even know when this book was written. I can't find a date in it, and I could never find it online. I imagine it was fairly early on. But that was Mentzer's basic philosophy for most of his career. So it might have been very at odds with the training of pro bodybuilders of the day, certainly, but I don't think it was necessarily inconsistent with what we're doing or what should be being done now in terms of the volumes. And again, this is limit failure sets. This is until the weight will not move. And there is that inverse relationship between how many sets you do and how close to proximity, how close to failure you are. And like, yes, now we know you do not have to go to limit failure to grow. I'm not saying that you do. That's not the point of this discussion, even though people are going to claim that that's what we're saying. It's simply that if you are training to that level, you do not need as many sets. Because another thing that Arthur Jones said in the 70s was basically is to the effect of the goal was to generate the maximum muscular stimulus in the lowest amount of exercise, which is something that Dante Trudell would repopularize with dog crap in the 2000s. Dante believed very steadfastly, and I do agree with him, that volume is what overtrains you. It's very hard to overtrain with intensity. The body is very self-limiting. His goal with dog crap, with the rest pause, was to get the greatest stimulus and the least amount of work to maximize your recovery, instead of just doing set after set after set, which cuts into recovery. That's a limiting factor. Also, your joints give out. So that was the basic idea, right? And again, fundamentally, I think that's a very reasonable approach. Moderate volumes, relatively reasonable frequencies, Now, as Mentzer progressed, once he retired in the 80s, then he just basically started working with people. And as he claims, like I said, he felt that Arthur Jones was still using too high of a frequency and too high of a volume. And maybe as people get stronger, I wouldn't disagree with that. I wouldn't have most people train full body 3 days a week. Even on an upper lower, you usually have to go to heavy light when you start to get strong. But he started paring down the amount of exercise he was giving to his consultations and his clients. More and more and more and more and more.
It became heavy duty as distinct from traditional HIT.
Yes, exactly. And that was the name. It was heavy duty, and that was published in his first. Like, heavy duty wasn't published till the early 90s. I think I looked that up.
Let's look it up again.
Let's look it up again to be sure. Yeah, January 1st, 1993. So that was written 13 years after the end of his career. And he presented what I guess he called the ideal routine. And it was basically a handful of sets, each muscle group once a week. So he had simply pared it down and pared it down and pared it down more. Now, I don't know if it was by this point. At one point, Mentzer was claiming that by doing this, you could reach your genetic limits in like 6 months. At this point, I'm sorry, he was starting to crack. The stuff, he'd become an ideologist, because a lot of his whole thing, right? And if you go read the Wikipedia and read his stuff, is like he was the bodybuilding philosopher. He believed that logic and critical thinking could get us to an optimized model of resistance training, which of course meant that he simply used logical precepts that led him to the conclusion that he already believed, like all philosophy. You simply start with I know you and I have a disagreement, somewhat of a disagreement about the relative utility and relevance of philosophy. The key is to just make your initial assumptions include your conclusion.
You are doing philosophy right now.
Huh?
So is this exercise that you're currently engaging in useless, I ask?
Well, no, what I'm saying is that this was Mentzer's approach. He had also latched onto objectivism, a la Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand, yeah.
And so, like, one of Mentzer's famous statements was, if we can send a man to the moon, we can figure out the optimal way to build muscle. Which I think is trying to get at the idea of, oh, well, if we can figure out the engineering principles that can split for space flight, we can figure out the physiology of muscle growth. The problem being that the laws of physics are very well established. Human physiology varies tenfold between any two people.
The moon landing was a hoax.
There's that too, because we do know that 1970s level CGI was amazing, because I saw the black hole, and that was in the 80s. Right.
Really something.
So he was taking, I know, but he was taking a logical, or are you? But he was taking a logical approach to it. But again, he'd already decided what he thought was the proper way to train, and you just work backwards from your conclusion. And so a lot of his books they're less about training and physiology and more about philosophical ramblings. I've only skimmed through snippets of it. But heavy duty, he just said he kept cutting it back and back and back for his clients, which is fine. If he was working with beginner Gen Pop, I'm sure that worked just fine. Also, he was probably pushing them further than they ever have. But if you look at heavy duty, like I said, it was a once a week, couple of 3 sets per muscle group. And then he started or it was at least like something like Wikipedia says 5 to 7 days between workouts for the same muscle group. So lower volume. And again, for Gen Pop, who's not trying to, be a bodybuilder, okay, that's fine. I mean, whatever.
Did he qualify that you can reach your genetics limit in 6 months as a natural or with anabolics? Because you could surpass what you could naturally achieve in 6 months with anabolics, certainly.
I don't remember I can't remember the exact quote, but I think it was in one of his later books. Now, there's a problem here and I want to call it, because I've said a couple things in previous years that I realize now I do need to correct. This Mr. America Heart guy, right? One of Mike's last books. He passed away before it was finished. And there's this dude named John Little. Now, John Little has his own hilarious output of books. including power factor training, which is a truly funny book because it shows why you shouldn't try to apply physics to biology. But apparently John Little took over the finishing of this book, and what he wrote had nothing to do with what Mike actually believed. That's in this video that you're going to link. So some of the things, it's entirely, like I said, frequently with some of these things, it's difficult to tell what was Mike being misinterpreted. Like, you know, it can be a little difficult, but heavy duty, certainly, you know, his whole thing was intensity is more important than volume. Going to failure is the key. And this was a precept that will show up again when we talk about some of the more modern HIT things. One of the logical arguments that gets thrown about is that the only intensities you can measure in the weight room are 0 and 100. That unless you go to failure, that is, you can only measure 100% by going to failure. And anything in between those two cannot be quantified. And obviously in the era of reps in reserve and bar speed and velocity measurements, I disagree with that. If you truly know what 100% is, you know that 2 reps short of that is 80. But that is a logical argument that you often get from the HITers. I don't know that Mentzer made that one necessarily, but a lot of his, like I said, apparently in one of the heavy duty books is very much about developing critical thinking. It's got nothing to do with training. There might as well be philosophy books with a little bit of training thrown in. Although Blood and Guts isn't much better, but we'll get to that here in a second. So that was really that was Mentzer's heavy duty, which I think was really the second evolution. It started with Jones's relatively moderate, relatively what I consider reasonable, rational approach, but it was already starting to pare it down a little bit. And again, for Mentzer's population, I don't know that he trained any bodybuilders. Maybe that was perfectly appropriate. Like I said, for the average
certainly
person,
he did demonstration videos with bodybuilders.
Probably, but some of that may simply have been to show what it looks like, right? Just to show, like, look, this is what a true HIT set looks like. I don't know. Maybe. I don't think Boyerko trained HIT. He might have taken him through a workout.
Oh, Mike Mentzer took him through at least one workout.
Sure, to sort of demonstrate it. And I quite imagine that many people who went through it did it and were like, yeah, I'm going to go back to my old way of training. And make no mistake, again, so people are clear, I'm not saying training. I've never been saying training to failure is. Go back and look at the videos, all the ones everybody lied about, and use strawman arguments. I'm just saying this is what it looks like. Not everyone can generate this level of intensity on a consistent basis. And just to sort of wrap up the Mentzer thing, I think a little bit, is there were rumors of his severe ketamine abuse and the fact that he ended up institutionalized for it. And that's apparently true. He was able to use that to drive his intensity. And he did that for his contest prep. He didn't do that in the off season though. So for all of that about, just do low volume to failure, he couldn't do it year round. That's just what he talked about. And it's no different than when you looked at, people would fall into the trap of going, this is what Arnold does. No, this is what he does for the 8 weeks going into contest. This is not what he's doing the rest of the year. And that's most of Mentzer's HIT. Like I said, he claimed that with all of his consultation and training clients that he used a variation on this, but he just kept paring it back and back and back. But I guarantee you, Gen Pop, they're not going to do full body leg extension, leg press squats to failure 2 days a week. I'm sorry, the general public is not going to do that. And that's perfectly fine. So that's kind of Mentzer. I mean, he wrote Heavy Duty in 93, and then there's Heavy Duty 2. There's a Wisdom of Mike Mentzer, and then I think there's the book that John Little kind of finished for him. And then he passed away relatively young, I think. He passed away at...
He was in his early 50s, wasn't he?
Yeah, and then...
and his brother Ray died
like 2 days later.
Really quite tragic.
1951 to 2001. So he was 50 years old of heart problems, apparently.
Oh, it says age 49 according to my Google search. Mike Mentzer.
The wiki says 51 to 2001, but it's in that range, certainly.
Ray Mentzer, 47.
Yeah, so that's very young.
Yeah.
But that was sort of the heavy duty chapter. Like I said, still relatively reasonable, fairly moderate. especially if you recognize that what he did was not what he did year round, and what he wrote about, he never trained that way. He trained more conventionally than not, just with very low volumes to failure, but most of the time, in his build-up, it was still higher volume for more frequency, because I guess he wanted to give his body a break from the amphetamines. So I think that brings us to the next chapter, and that's Dorian Yates, who...
Yeah, how did Dorian Yates incorporate HIT principles into his training?
So it's still, I had trouble sort of tracking this down, and unfortunately, Dorian's book, Blood and Guts, is a lot less training and a lot more not training. For being a book that long, there's only one chapter with actual workout routines, and it doesn't even have his advanced routine. It's a very oddly written book, given what it is. It seemed to be as much concept than there's anything else. I was a little surprised. So it's hard for me to tell how early Dorian adopted like higher intensity training principles. I could never actually get to the bottom of when that was the case. If he did it from an early, I think in his book, he said he did it before he met Mike Mentzer, at least on some level. I've seen it claimed that as much as Mike Mentzer is given credit, basically they met once, and that was Mentzer claim. I don't know. It's very difficult to get to the bottom of this. I'm not saying one is true or is not. It's very difficult to figure out exactly what was going on. But there's no doubt that Dorian's style of training was influenced by these same principles, whether it was by Arthur Jones in general, Mentzer's heavy duty. Certainly he was approaching it from that standpoint. But from what I could gather, he didn't seem to agree with Mentzer's extremely limited exercise selection. And that was probably one of the biggest differences. Like, again, it was hard to tell in all the reading that I did. Well, so I've got a note. In his early training, he was doing 7 sets per muscle group or so, basic split routine. Like that's in Blood and Guts. That was the stuff. That was what he called his version of HIT, was Blood and Guts training. So that was like his basic split. And then that eventually evolved into what he was doing. I think what people think of as like the classic Blood and Guts training, if you go look at that video of what he was doing later in his career. But I think one of the big differences between him and Mentzer, all of them, was he didn't believe in as limited of an exercise selection. He felt that for full muscular development, you needed more exercises. Now, he did only train each muscle group once a week at the extremes as he got much stronger. But one difference that doesn't get really appreciated. So if you read Heavy Duty, he talks about, doing the least amount of warm-up possible, which probably wasn't much. But if you're on, machines and doing nothing but pull over to pull down, you can probably get away with that. You actually look at Dorian's workouts. They're not as low volume as you think. And when we talk about the internet version of HIT, who tend to claim Dorian, you'll see why what they are talking about and what Dorian actually did are not the same thing. So Dorian would typically, if you look up some of his workouts, do on average maybe 4 exercises per muscle group. And if you look at them, they're actually very intelligently selected from a biomechanical standpoint, right? One of the things, you look at old school bodybuilders, even guys in the gym now, they're just doing the same movement pattern over and over and over again, right? Barbell bench press, all right, fine. Machine chest press, that's the same movement pattern.
Yeah, flat dumbbell press.
Guys, you've just done the same exercise 3 times. At least pick a different, where the resistance is at, like.
All right. Push-ups.
Yeah, and then push-ups to burnout. I'm like, you've just done the same movement 4 times.
Yeah.
Do a bench press, do a pec deck, do an incline. Like, Dorian didn't do that. So you look at like his back routine, and it was like, okay, bent over rows, like the Yates row, right? Yeah. Biceps, lats, mid back. He would do a pull down variant. He would do like a hammer iso row, like a one arm dumbbell row. And then you finish with a pullover, right? So these are actually distinct movement patterns. Right, you got one that's scapular retraction with shoulder extension. You got the pullover, which is isolated lats. You've got a one arm row, which is more, and same thing. And for rear delts, he did reverse pec deck and rear delt dumbbell laterals. Because how many damn exercises do you need for the rear delts? right? You look at his triceps workout. He did a nose breaker. So he did one exercise with the shoulder in flexion.
Mm-hmm.
He did a 2-arm tricep pushdown, and he did a 1-arm tricep pushdown as the finisher. And that was it. Like, really intelligent exercise selection. Quads was like Smith machine squat, hack squat, leg press, leg extension. Like, what the fuck else do you need? Sorry, what the hell else do you need? Now, but if you look at what he did, he didn't just rock up and do one set to failure. He did multiple warm-up sets, pyramiding up, and he did one top set to failure. And those are, again, I'll circle back to this, because that's really more of the modern misinterpretation, right? I'm fairly sure, I imagine Arthur Jones allowed some amount of warm-up. Mentzer allowed some amount of warm-up. This idea that Dorian just rocked up and did one set to failure, that's not true. He worked up to one top set to failure. And I think when you're as strong as he was, we could probably count that third warm-up set as a work set, as contributing to the training volume.
Do you reckon it was within a few reps of failure though?
Don't know, and I'm too lazy. I don't know, but if
does
you're
anyone? I mean, other than Dorian?
I'm sure if you go, if it's in the blood and guts video, I cannot watch training videos. They bore me to absolute tears. But like, he's on the hammer incline press, right? And his top weight is 3 wheels per side plus a 25. I did a wheel plus 15, 2 wheels plus 12, 3 wheels plus 8. Like, I don't know, but I have to think that contributed somewhat.
It just annoys me how people speculate baselessly about how many hard sets Dorian Yates actually did.
Sure. I don't know.
If you listen to him, he just did, 4 hard sets for his chest, incline press, pec deck, like just one hard set for each of the 4 exercises he did. Whereas if you listen to someone else, they're like, oh, no, it was 12 sets because he did 3 working sets for each body, for each exercise.
That's absolutely not true. He absolutely didn't do 12 work sets. But I would tend to argue, I'd have to go watch Blood and Guts, which again, I'm not going to do, that I would contend that third set, the final warm-up set, unless he only did a couple reps, contributed somewhat to the volume. And I don't think Dorian ever said, I only do 4 sets. He said, I work up to one top set all out.
Yeah.
And there's a famous story, apparently, that if you watch the videos, like, it's all out, right? I put up a couple when I was pointing out what failure was to Ike Misratel. Mike Has No Tan, 10% of all my books.
Mm-hmm.
Not the new one. GLP-1's only on Amazon. It's $10. Go get it. You want it. But, right, frequently he'd have his training partner assist him, do assisted reps, like on leg extension. He'd hit failure and he'd get a little bit of help, to go beyond failure, which does contribute to the volume, right? His training, what people think he did is not really what he did. And you should go watch the videos of him doing work sets to see, or him taking people through work sets, because that's something he does put up. These bodybuilders go to him who are used to volume training, and he's like, let me take you through a workout. And by the time these guys are crawling out of the leg press to go vomit outside, right, they realize what true failure is and that they're nowhere close to it. Again, not saying that's how you should train, just making a point of this is what he did. But I guess as the story goes, a camera crew came to video one of his workouts, and they missed one of his sets of an exercise, and they said, can you do it again? He said, no, come back next week. He's like, that's the point. I can't do this more than once on any given exercise. When you give it your all, that's your all by definition. So he was training each muscle group once a week, and we can quibble about that, whether or not that's ideal or not. The anabolics do play a role here. I think that's not the point of this discussion. It's more what he did. But his volumes were somewhere between what Arthur Jones was recommending, again, admittedly for a different population, what Mentzer ended up recommending. It was a happy medium. He made very reasonable exercise choices. I would point out that as he evolved through his career, he tended to abandon a lot of barbell movements because that's the big 5, right? He had a minor injury back squatting, and he changed to the Smith machine and realized, oh, I get a better quad stimulus on this. Not to mention, and again, this is within the context of how he trained. When you're that strong, back squatting to failure for most people is an accident waiting to happen. I'm not saying I've done it. It can be done. I don't think most should do it. And most don't have the wherewithal to push themselves to that. But
I've been pinned before doing barbell back squats.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not for singles either. It sucks.
Yeah, no for reps. Yeah, I've done it too. And I mean, I put videos up of people doing it. I don't advocate it, but but when you get that strong, when you've got, 4 or 5 wheels aside, if something goes wrong, it goes very wrong very quickly. And it is simply not tenable at that level. And as a good example, everyone's like, machines and suck and this and that and the other. It's like, okay, we look at Dorian, who trained mostly on machines with very relatively low volumes. And he's in his 60s. He looks pretty good. He had a couple minor injuries. He had a torn bicep. And then you look at Ronnie. Ronnie did nothing but maxed out barbell training, high volumes, and he's in a wheelchair. And I'm not saying that that's what, but the reality is that when you get strong, doing lots of heavy barbell squats and deadlifts to try to get big is a mistake. Machines you can do much more safely.
Yeah.
And not get wrecked.
I think we need to be careful, though, not to attribute Ronnie's injuries to his training, but rather perhaps his surgeries.
Well, but if the surgeries probably came out of the training. I mean, when you're just beating yourself up that much, shit goes wrong. And then
it's not as if he didn't get the surgeries for any reason.
Sure, but then you get the surgeries and continue training like that when you already have problems, then I'm sorry, I'm not saying it did, but I think there is there's a lesson to potentially be learned here in the sense of when you get very strong, if you're trying to train intensely, big barbell movements can become a real problem.
Yeah.
On top of, got news, not being as frequently as good for training the actual musculature. It's just as something else, again, different topic, but as I keep pointing out to people in consults or in my group, right? Power lifters try to lift the heaviest weights as easily as possible. That's what they do. That's why they use the leverages they do and the techniques that they do. And bodybuilders try to lift the lightest weights in as intense as way as possible. You look at the bodybuilder techniques, the things they do instead of, in terms of partial reps and non-lock and 1 1/4. The goal is to, powerlifters are trying to train and practice and improve a movement. Bodybuilding is about training a muscle. And that means picking the best so that the target muscle is what gets the training stimulus. If balance on a back squat is what limits you, your quads don't get a stimulus. If low back on a back squat is what limits you, quads don't get a stimulus. That's a whole separate thing. So that was Dorian's blood and guts training. He also did things like when he would start to feel a little bit beaten up, he would just take a deload week when he needed it, where I think I'm not sure if he cut volume or intensity, but he would just take an easy week or 1 or 2 easy weeks every so often.
Why do you think HIT never became the dominant training methodology in bodybuilding?
Oh, I guarantee you that when Dorian was winning the Olympias, I guarantee you it was. I don't remember because I wasn't paying attention. But I mean, when all the muscle magazines, because Weider was still dominant and always has been as Muscle and Fitness and Flex. When most people, that's their exposure to training is nothing but volume training. You're not even aware of anything else, especially pre-internet. I don't think people would have been writing, his blood and guts was, when was Dorian competing? Hang on.
Well, wasn't he Mr. Olympia from 92 to 97?
Right. So realize that was the earliest days of the internet. People still were only being exposed to what was in the magazines for the most part. So I don't think you would have seen a lot of people adopting that training because they just weren't aware of it. Now, maybe people in the bodybuilding subculture, but the average trainee who's reading Muscle and Fitness or Flex, they never would have been aware of that style of training. Because what has always happened, this is true of all sports, whatever the top guy is doing, that is how you should train. When West Side was all people talked about, everybody trained West Side. Then Smoloff, then Shako, and then that all went out of style. And whenever people get into a sport, they're like, well, this is what the top guys are doing. That is how you should train. And the reality is there are many paths to a goal. Dorian's was one. And I do think, again, this is a whole separate thing. Anabolics do change things. and I've said, and I will say this, whether it's low volume training, high volume training, or whatever, to a degree, it makes the training not matter as much because the steroids are driving a lot of the bus. A lot of great bodybuilders got big with volume. There's no doubt about that. Dorian was amazing with low volume. Does that mean that Dorian, no. For whatever reason, Dorian was dominant during his time. And then he got injured. There's a really good video on YouTube that I could not find where he talks about that. Maybe there's a documentary on it. And like his final Olympia, because he tore a bicep going in. And I guess it's kind of considered that final Olympia was a little bit of a gift. Like he probably shouldn't. But he had
people argue that NASA should have beat Dorian that year.
But that there is a little bit of inertia that goes with being a champion for so long. But that was when he retired, because he said, now I can no longer bring my best. And that's when he retired from the sport. So Nasser didn't train that style, and he was, just as amazing. So I don't, if Dorian had been successful now in the era of the internet, I suspect that training, because people would have gone, well, Dorian is the best. Dorian trains blood and guts. Ergo, blood and guts is how you should train. But at the time, the infrastructure just wasn't there. People just weren't hearing about it. Certainly not in the Wiener magazines. So that was sort of, I don't know if that was the next evolution of HIT, but it was certainly, like I said,
a manifestation anyway.
Yeah.
It was rooted in those principles.
Sure. And I think, again, I would put it, if you look at the volumes and exercises, I would put it somewhere between Arthur Jones's original ideas and Mentzer's final end of his career ideas in terms of volumes, especially. But again, different populations. Dorian was looking for maximum muscular development to step on stage. And that's a very different thing than Gen Pop looking to get basic training, size, and strength when they don't have a lot of time.
Would you say that HIT, or particularly the Jones manifestation of it, is effective for general population seeking muscular development?
I mean, like I said, I think if the average person farting around in the gym for 2 hours, 6 days a week, were to train more like what Arthur Jones wrote, they'd get a hell of a lot further and have more time to do more interesting things than hang out in the gym. But it requires a level of effort and intensity that a lot simply aren't willing to do. And again, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't train to failure, but I do think the average person would certainly get a hell of a lot further doing that than they are doing what they're doing. And certainly than they are listening to the fitness industry change their recommendations daily. I guess now Menno's telling people you can grow at 7 reps.
7 reps in reserve.
I couldn't even be bothered to go look at what he's citing, but yeah, considering that most people who think they're at 0 reps in reserve are really at 5, well, now they're going to be at 12. So, I mean, they're still training harder than Ike Misratel, but they're sure as hell not going to get anywhere. So yeah, so I think that would be kind of like the third phase. And then we get to the internet. And that's where it got real stupid.
Tell me about it.
And I was there. I mean, seriously, I was there the whole time. I watched it all develop. And interestingly, of course, you know me, I was arguing with both sides. Because I had this crazy idea that maybe somewhere in the middle. Like, you can find HIT guys who'd be like, Lyle's a volume guy, and there's one idiot on this one mailing list who's like, Lyle loves HIT. And I'm like, you're both idiots. And I'm like, Lyle loves context and the idea that maybe it's just a tool in the toolbox. But that's too hard of a concept for cultists to believe. Because training has become religion, just like diet is religion. Once you have your belief system, everything else that's not, I mean, that was Mentzer's attitude, which I think is part of why he was very off-putting to people. He didn't just say this is the better way to train. He said this is the only way you should train. This is the only proper way to train. And I think that's a step too far. But that's ideology. That's not physiology. So HIT online probably encompasses various things. But as I remember it, and realize, I mean, hilariously, I wrote for an HIT website called Cyberpump, one of the very early websites. And I wrote for I wrote for non-HIT websites. I was at that point more tied in with Hardgainer philosophy, which we can make sort of a diversion because there is a relationship, but they're not synonymous. Mainly there's a relationship in what started out as a very rational approach to training, went completely stupid after 10 years, because that's what happens. What are otherwise reasonable messages get more and more and more and more extreme until they become utterly moronic. And that's kind of what happened with HIT. Because the original, again, the original Jonesian version, which is moderate volumes, the original Mentzerian version before he kept paring it down, even the Yates version, what HIT Online sort of became initially, it was all you needed was one set to failure, no warm-ups, usually one exercise per muscle group, period. You would just rock up, do your set to failure. Frequently, that you would move very quickly between exercises, try to get an aerobic effect. Jones pushed that too, but a lot of that is like, yeah, you just move through the Nautilus circuit
So
pretty
just for
quickly.
general health?
No, they believe that
Like a
by
side
moving
benefit?
quickly. No, they believe that aerobic training was worthless and you get the same benefits by just not taking rest between your sets, which is not true.
Yeah, that just compromises your performance.
Yeah. Yes,
in
you get
resistance
tired.
training.
You get tired, but you don't get really quality training.
Yeah.
Oh, and don't let me forget, I should also talk about Dr. Ken Leistner at some point. You've probably never even heard. I never even heard that name.
No, I've heard of him.
Yeah. So that was kind of HIT. It became even a more extreme version, right? And that's why they tended to claim Dorian. Oh, he does one set to failure. No, he doesn't. He does one top set to failure. That's very different. And a lot of the HIT arguments of the day were, again, they were logical arguments. They weren't physiological arguments. I think one of my favorites, well, I'll come back to my favorite, but one of them, their belief was, if you don't improve at every workout, if you don't make progress workout to workout to workout, number one, you're overtraining. But number two, you need to train less frequently. So once every other day becomes every third, every fourth, every fifth, every seventh, every ninth. If you're not, and you actually end up, of course, making it worse because now you're taking so long between workouts. Because their idea, so one of their ideas, and there's so many of them, there was Inroad, but their idea was like, okay, recovery can improve with training, but it cannot improve as much as your strength can improve. So maybe recovery goes up by 20%. By the time your strength is up by 40%, well, you can cut into your recovery so much that you may need 10 days to recover between workouts. And if you're not able to improve by one rep or add weight at every workout, you need to take longer between workouts. And you just saw this get more and more from once a week to once every 10 days. It just kept getting longer. And of course, people weren't making any progress. They were detraining between workouts. But my favorite, well, if you're going to do more than one set per exercise, why not do 10? Why not do 100? That was one of their logic was, well, if you're going to do more than one set, why stop at any number? Do as many as possible. Because God forbid you pick, there's clearly no in between. Intensity is 0 or 100%. Volume is 1 or 100 sets. Now, what's funny is that now in 2025, apparently the people now heard the HIT guys say that and thought, yeah, why not do 100? Apparently they took that as a recommendation rather than a logical argument against volume. Because now we got these guys saying, oh, 52 sets per week. Or we did.
How about Mike Israel's video titled, More Volume Equals More Growth? Now indisputable.
Sure, exactly. And wait till next month and it'll be you're doing too much volume because this industry is a tragedy. But so that was because, clearly you can't do 3 sets. It's 1 set or infinite sets. Those are the only options. I wrote an article years ago called Excluding the Middle. There's probably a Latin term for that. But basically, look, it's not one or the other. It's not rigid or eating pizza for 90% of your calories. It's not carnivore or jelly beans. I can't explain. Said it's a religion at this point.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
was,
and just to be clear, you're not saying the middle is the best simply because it's the middle. That would be argumentum ad temperantium.
No, of course I'm not. I'm saying that the idea that it's got to be this or this is not. They think
it's like a false dichotomy.
Yes, exactly. Now, yes, there is a time to make, an argumentum ad extremum to make a point. But that doesn't, you're not trying to actually, that's just to make a point about something rather than to try to make an argument for a certain training philosophy, right? Even Arthur Jones allowed you could do up to 3 sets per muscle group. The HT guys are like, nope, more than anything, if you're going to do more than one, you might as well do them all. Might as well do an infinite number. Why not 10? Why not 100? Why not 200? So there was a lot of silliness. And again, you had the NSCA guys on one side, the volume periodization guys, you had the HIT guys on the other side, and you had me arguing with both because I thought they were both not wrong, but they were both being myopic. So this guy wrote this thing, Lyle loves HIT. And I said, no, Lyle sees HIT as a tool.
Yeah. And you might love some of the underlying principles.
No, it's just, again, it gets
but just
into,
not the conclusion that's drawn from them.
It's, I mean, all training, it's a matter of looking at pros and cons, context, right? Like when I did that four video thing on, failure, because Kasem was like, they had this little pie chart, like people who talk about training to failure have never trained to failure, whatever. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to explain it from start to finish. And then I asked him when I could get my official N1 protractor to make sure I did lateral raises first, and I never heard back. But it's a matter of...
reached out to me, by the way.
Yeah.
He was nice to me,
whatever. He's
usually
usually
you're ever
nice
in Colorado, come train
with
me.
He's usually nice to me, and I'm distinctly not nice back.
He likes you. He likes you.
I have no idea why, because I've done nothing but tell him that I think he's an absolute booger-eating moron on more occasions.
He's a bit of a masochist, I reckon. He likes it, Lyle.
God, he must. People do, as much as they bitch about it. They like it when I'm mean to them. For some reason, I get away with that. But anyway, so to try to this guy's like, Lyle loves HIT. I said, okay, let me explain to you. Here's a workout I just put my training partner through. I forget, we were doing back or something. I said, okay, so he did high pulls, 5x5 submaximal. He did low to high row on a hammer machine for 3x8 to 1 set, 1 rep short of failure. And he did shrug backs 1 set to failure. I go, do I love HIT? Do I love periodization? Do I love submaximal volume? Do I love machines? Do I love free weights? Or maybe, just maybe, is there more to training than having the simple answer machine? Right? And I said the same thing I did when I did this video series. I said, look, it's a relationship between volume and intensity and even exercise choice, right? Am I going to barbell squat someone to failure? No. Am I going to leg extension someone to failure? Maybe. Depends. And so I was trying to make this point. And I said, look, here would be a completely appropriate chest workout for a power lifter, right? 3 sets of 3 at 5 RM. Followed by 4 sets of 6 to 8 of chest press, 2 sets of pec deck to failure.
As opposed to 4 sets of 6 bench press at 85% of 1 RM with 3 to 5 minute rest intervals.
Or whatever. But my point is just that, look,
that was a reference to, never mind, I won't go on.
But it's just a matter of, what's the context? Do I think HIT makes some good points? Sure. Do I? It's a matter of what are you trying to do? What machines? What's the tool? What's the goal? And it just depends. If someone tells me I can't be in the gym very long, I've got 30 minutes. I can't give them a volume workout. If they can only do 2 sets, they sure as shit better go to failure. And if they tell me I want to do 10 sets per exercise, I go, well, you might want to reconsider that. I'm going to go, you better do 3 to 4 reps in reserve. I have this crazy thing I do called context. If you want to go to failure, you got to do less volume. If you must do or want to do less volume, you must go to failure, and vice versa. God forbid we consider context or nuance in this effing industry. So that was basic HIT. Actually, I'm going to use this to quickly transition and talk a little bit about Dr. Ken. So in this same listserv, right, they were all periodization and this and Russian and blah, 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 blah. They were like, well, all top powerlifters have trained this way. I said, Dr. Ken Leistner, his son, adopted son, is an absolute monster and a powerlifting record holder. And they said, oh, that's just genetics, right? Because if someone succeeds with periodization, it's the training. If someone succeeds with something else, it's genetics. These were the games they used to play with me. The same games people play now. Because as Ike Nisertel has told us, all successful prep coaches, they just got lucky. Regardless.
Yeah. Well, genetics, it's one of those things that's unfalsifiable.
Well, but it's not the point. They're just saying out of hand, if you succeeded at a sport without training in the way we think is appropriate, I mean, Mentzer would probably make the same argument in the opposite direction. Oh, Arnold may have gotten away with volume training, but for him, it wasn't the training that made him. For him, it was genetics. For me, it was the training. The game is played in both directions. I'm not saying either group is right or wrong. The entire approach is, if it's not what I did, it's genetics. But if it's what I did, it's the training. Regardless, Dr. Ken Leistner. Dr. Ken was a chiropractor and lifter. He has this amazing series in Milo magazine called Tales from the Loft. And he was just this crazy-ass dude in New York who grew up in a very hard part of town, very hard part of the world, who got into lifting weights. And I don't know if he was ever directly influenced by Arthur Jones, whether it just intuitively made sense to him to train as hard as possible. It may have just been part of his psychology. And the man was a maniac. There's a video in my Facebook group I put up of him taking people through workouts. It is some of the craziest crap you've ever seen. Stuff like, especially later in his career, even for powerlifting, he's like, no, low reps are to practice strength. You develop strength with higher reps. His guys would do like a set of 50 all out set of 50 in the back squat, straight to a Romanian deadlift standing on a railroad piece of metal, all the way to, like, you read the workouts they used to do, and they were just these super short, high intensity barbell work machines when they had access to them. You know, they'd be like 2 warm-ups and then a maximum set of 3 and a maximum set of 6, and then an all-out set of squats, set of 50. Or if they had a leg press, they'd leg press. And he trained twice a week, absolutely balls to the wall, total, absolute, maximal failure. His gym was famous, Iron Island, for having puke buckets. Which I'm not saying, like, vomiting is not the goal of training, but that was how hard he pushed people. And I said, I don't know if he was necessarily influenced by any of these people. I'd have to go look. He may very well have known about Arthur Jones. That was just the way it made sense for him to train. But he was a maniac. I don't think outside of, I mean, he wrote for Powerlifting USA. He wrote for Milo. He wrote for Hardgainer a little bit, a couple times. But yeah, he was another interpretation of HIT, but it was just insanity. Truly, like I said, anybody in my Facebook group, go search his name. Ken Leistner, Leistner, and there's a video of him training. He was nuts. He's unfortunately passed away, but he was nuts.
Who the hell wrote Super Squats? I'm trying to remember.
Randall Strawson?
Yeah, Randall Strawson. And then there were other writers in that HIT sphere, such as
I wouldn't know.
Stuart McRobert.
I would not call Super Squats HIT. That was a 20-rep squat routine. That was more of a very... Strawson was writing a squat 3 times a week article since the 60s. Super Squats was about 20-rep squats, not
Wouldn't
HIT
you say
per se.
It was kind of HIT adjacent insofar as the volume was relatively low and it involved sort of rest pause training.
Well, right, but HIT really didn't involve rest pause. They were all about, you know,
you're right, yeah.
Movements. Yeah, I wouldn't put those. I really wouldn't. So rest and breathing squats had been around since the early 20th century. Like, that was nothing new whatsoever. So I wouldn't actually really tie that in with HIT. I mean, Darden, absolutely. Every book he wrote was this crazy ass HIT stuff. And every book was the same. He published the same book like 30 times. And it would have the 1-minute chin, 30-second concentric, eccentric, heavy duty stuff, you know, all this high intensity stuff. You're supposed to drink 1 liter of ice water because he didn't understand the difference between a lower C calorie and uppercase C calorie, that would burn off fat through having to warm it because he doesn't know how to do the math. And like, it's all just the same book done over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. I had one of them in college that I only vaguely remember the details of, but it was just the same. He was a very prolific HIT author. He's still around. I mean, he had a forum and he had a following and all that. But yeah, so that was kind of like least the early stages of the online HITers. And they were known as the HIT Jedis for some reason. And I don't know why, honestly, that nomenclature, but they were very much proselytizers about HIT. But one of the interesting things that you saw was that they would do HIT and keep stretching out the frequency. And then when they made no gains, they would say, oh, it's just genetics. They would use the card against themselves. Go, oh, it's not that the training's wrong. The training's right. It's like Mike. Oh, my diet's fine. I genetically carry more fat on my, sorry, Ike. I genetically carry more fat on my low back. Oh, my diet and training are perfect. They would use a reverse Uno card on themselves.
He has big love handles that store a lot of water from back when he got fat on purpose to try to do the spirit bulk.
Yeah, exactly. It's all genetics. And coaches that are successful are just lucky because he's smarter than all of them. Exactly. So that was sort of the early HIT stuff. Now, at some point in there, and I don't know, I think it was sort of coincident with that. Then we had super slow. And this was amazing. So super slow was the brainchild of Ken Hutchins. And if you ever have the opportunity to read the original Super Slow manual, which you won't, it's very hard to find. My mentor had a copy. I got a chance to look at it. It is some of the greatest comedy you will ever see. There are gems of awesome in this book. Now, before getting to that, actually, let's go back. One of the things that Arthur Jones actually was a big advocate of was using a relatively controlled lifting speed. 2 seconds concentric, 3 to 4 seconds eccentric. Now, his original logic for that was a little bit skewed, and I'm not going to try to explain it. But it's generally believed that the early Nautilus machines, if you went any faster, the chains would come off the cam, that it was more of an engineering reason. I don't know if that's true, but I've seen that claimed. But still, I have no fundamental problem with that. Like, I tend to generally prefer more explosive lifting speeds, but I like a controlled eccentric. He wasn't wrong. And I think if you go watch the way Dorian trained, even Mentzer, it was along those lines.
I like maximum concentric repetition speeds because I find that it's an easier approach to lifting to standardize.
I agree with you. You can back when tempo was the thing in the 90s, you spend more time counting tempo than you do training, unless you use a metronome, and nobody does that. So back when Poliquin's and Ian King's tempo prescriptions were a thing, I'm just explode up, don't throw it, not ballistic, explosive. Up. And I mean, if it's heavy enough, it's not going to move that fast. If you're using, weights that are too light, that's an issue. But, if you're doing 6 to 8s or whatever, it won't move that fast. And then, controlled eccentric, don't drop it. But then super slow came in. And I don't remember the exact original. Super slow had several different variants. But the idea, I'm going to tell a great story in a second. The basic idea was that it was HIT. It was one set to failure, but it focused on movement speed. And the concentric was either 5 or 10 seconds, and the eccentric was 5 or 10 seconds. And this was done to failure, which usually occurred at 5 or 6 reps. Because think about set time, right? That's 5 or 6 reps at 15 to 20 seconds a piece. That's a 2-minute set. If you're doing 6 reps at 10 up, 10 down, it is painfully slow, right? So imagine, an overhead press. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3. You get the idea. Or maybe it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that has shown up in other forms. Fred Hahn has slow burn. There's other, but it's all variations on that theme. Now, Hutchins' rationale for this, and this was brilliant, had to do with not understanding physics, is what it really comes down to. So let me come back to that. couple of the gems in the slow burn book. One, you should never do a Valsalva while you're pooping because you might have a stroke. That is not a joke. That is in his book. You should not breath hold while you're pooping because you might stroke out.
I mean, undoubtedly someone in human history has had a stroke while on the toilet. As to whether or not the holding in the breath caused it.
Sure, but the better one, and I'm going to probably garble this a little bit. I read this years ago. So he's a big believer in machines, and this is about the time like MedX was coming out. Some of the later, like they derived from Nautilus after Jones had already passed away. And they believed, he wrote, that machines were better, especially for women, because the average woman lacked the motor control to engage in even basic daily activities. Not a joke, okay? I probably have the quote not, because this is why when you go to the restaurant, you see women all the time with their fork just going, I mean, you just can't make stuff like this up. But I remember vividly reading something roughly to that effect. It's like I said, you'll never see a copy of it because it's desperately out of print. Amazing. But his argument behind the slow speeds, well, there's probably a couple of them. There used to be this dumb idea about intramuscular friction that the HITers used, and I'm going to bother with that, about why you should use this. Their argument for why eccentric strength was greater than concentric had to do with friction within the muscle. It's not that at all. The studies came later going, yeah, friction coefficient is near zero. Neither here nor there. But his belief was that injuries occur due to high joint accelerations. Right, and this does sort of derive from Arthur Jones. Arthur Jones believed that the first repetitions of a set were more dangerous than the later reps of a set. And his logic was this, and this is part of why they controlled lifting. What he said was, at the beginning of the movement, when your muscle fibers are fresh, you can move the bar much faster than at the end when they're tired. So by accelerating the weight faster when you're fresh in the earlier part of the set, you're imposing greater forces on muscle and tendon and connective tissue. Which...
What do you make of that?
I mean, I think it's... Well, it all comes down to the fact that these people don't understand physics. Especially not Ken Hutchins and especially not Fred Hahn. So,
what's the fault in their logic?
Here's their logic. F equals ma, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. Ergo, the higher the acceleration, the higher the force. It's that simple. That's it. That's the sum total of their logic. Here's the problem. That's not the complete equation, right? It's the sum of forces equals ma. You have to include gravity. You've got the acceleration up, or you've got the gravity pulling down. Now, my mentor was an engineer, and he actually made me work through this problem. He's like, if you cannot do the physics on this, you don't get to talk about exercise. He made me work through it, and I won't be able to do it anymore because I'm too old. My brain doesn't work like this anymore. But it's because it's the sum of the forces equals ma. Well, the sum of forces is mg minus ma, or ma minus mg, right? Gravity is pulling down. So in their logic, at a 2-second concentric, like the accelerations are so high that you're just going to tear the tendon from the bone. But it's not actually true. When you go through and you work it out and factor in gravity and make some incorrect assumptions about, because we're like, you're moving a bar over a meter, we're going to assume a 2-second concentric. You have to make assumptions about equal acceleration and deceleration. Like there's a bunch of simplifying assumptions. And again, I could not do the math for you right now. But what you find is that anything between a 2-second concentric and a 10-second concentric, the differences in forces and external joint forces is essentially nil. Like, yeah, between half a second and 2 seconds, it's higher. But it's because they didn't understand that gravity. Okay, so my mentor wrote an article about this for Hardgainer because Fred Hahn had contributed a super slow article, used F equals ma. My mentor wrote in and said, actually, this is how the physics works. And here's what happens when you graph it out.
That's awesome.
Oh no, I'm not done. It gets better. Fred Hahn wrote in and said, it is incorrect to include gravity in these equations. Now, here's the implication of that. If gravity doesn't apply to training, this means that lying on your back and barbell bench pressing 400 pounds requires the same force as sliding it on frictionless rails. Gravity doesn't count. If moving 400 pounds is the same regardless of gravity, those two are equivalent. This is how badly they misunderstand physics.
And so did your mentor write in another paper to demonstrate the manifest misunderstanding?
Well, I don't remember, but at this point, Dr. Ken wrote in and said, as interesting as watching this debate go on, wouldn't it be more useful to talk about productive training? Dr. Ken actually chimed into the pages of Hardgainer on this one. But that's where super slow comes from, is that a misapplication of
that's
F
not
equals
really
MA.
fair, Ken's response, because the discussion of training is rooted in physics.
I know, but he
so,
just... But in his mind, he's like, this is a bunch of engineering math that the average person isn't going to care about, read, whatever. So let's just move on. Now,
I don't like that. But anyway.
I know, whatever. I'll see if I can I can go probably find them and scan. I've got the entire run of Hardgainer because I wrote for it. And so did my mentor, and I knew Stuart McRobert for a while. And so that was the basis of super slow. Now, the super slow guys had some other great ideas. One, you don't need warm-ups. As long as the first repetitions are slow, you don't need warm-ups. Well, they're not wrong.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Now, what were you going to say?
Just with like a very high rep set, for example. I mean, you clearly don't need to warm up as much for a very high rep set to concentric failure compared to a single to concentric failure if your goal is not to be injured.
Well, if you look at, if you're assuming 6 reps at 20 seconds apiece, a 2-minute set, that's about 60% of 1 RM. You don't need warm-ups because it is a warm-up.
Yes. That's sort of what I was implying.
A super slow set is a warm-up set.
To begin.
Yes. So, of course, you don't need a warm-up set.
Yeah.
Especially on your machine. You absolutely don't. I don't disagree with them, just not for the reasons they think. And when studies have been done, they've shown that super slow is drastically inferior to regular training. Beyond a certain rep speed, the fall off, the load becomes so insignificant that it doesn't matter. That it maybe take it to limit failure, because failure is failure is failure.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
It's also the most god awful, boring way to train you can even imagine. You have to use a metronome.
Yeah.
Now, I have done it. However, it was for a very specific reason. Because like everything,
you're injured.
Yeah. Years ago, doing something dumb on deadlifts, I strained a ligament in my low back. My form broke, popped something. Then, like a true moron, I finished the workout. Because real men always finish the workout. Whatever, is back stuff on machines. It took a couple months for the acute injury to go away. And then when I returned to training, there was no doubt any sort of high-speed movement that pulled, like on lats or on chest, would stress the low back. So I did 5-second, I think it was a 5-10, 5-second concentric, 10-second east. Simply to get back in training and to deliberately reduce joint forces. And it's the same reason I would have used blood flow restriction or low load training. Right? Yeah. In the modern era, I would have used that instead to deliberately reduce the loading and those accelerations. Because there's no doubt if you've got a low back injury and you're exploding on a pull down, that is because the lats are pulling directly up, and I had a strained spinal ligament. It was productive for that. And then I moved back into regular training. So that was super slow. And it was super dumb. But it's still around. And still making the same basic physics mistakes. And they just won't. I mean, whatever. They want, and it's the same basic ideas. You don't need aerobic training. Just move through every exercise. You should only, 20 minutes once or twice a week is all you need for training. Okay. Cool. Number of successful athletes ever created was super slow.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And whatever, for Gen Pop, I met someone the other day and they're like, yeah, they trained at Fred Hahn's facility. And if you ever,
Wow.
not that I want to dump too hard on Fred, but we used to, man, talk about, he and I tied it up, still would, whatever. At least Drew Bay and I are buddies now. We used to tie it up back in the day, but we both got older and matured a little bit. Do I agree with him on a lot of what he says? No, but whatever. It's all good. But yeah, so yeah, it's all very, very, very dumb. The HITers, as is common with trend followers, tends to latch on to, whatever the new trend is in their thing, right? There's certain personality types. I've seen it. Back in the day, remember when Vibrams were a thing? People who were into paleo were into CrossFit.
Those were shoes, right?
Yeah, those were the shoeless
weird
shoes.
toe shoes.
Yes, they were
right?
meant to be. Yeah, they were meant to have no padding and be natural. You couldn't walk barefoot on the pavement, so we had the Vibrams. But invariably, people who were into CrossFit, were into paleo, were into Vibrams. Fad followers follow and pose running, and whatever the new trend is, they jump on it as the new greatest thing, and they're like, get really self-righteous about it until the next new cool thing comes up, and then they jump on that. It's whoever the new guru and the new expert is. So during the HIT wars in the 2000s, one of the things we kept trying to explain to them was that, look, the reason that you're not progressing between workouts is because you're training too infrequently. Because you keep stretching it out further and further and further. You're detraining between workouts. Partly because when you go, because a lot of it, okay, so at one point, the HIT stuff, even in the Hardgainer stuff, not only failure, right? Not just, last rep. You would do a limit rep into a maximal isometric. 7, 10, and then done. And sometimes you would do eccentric failure. Now that is absolutely neurologically exhausting. I will not disagree with that. Concentric failure is one thing. Isometric failure is a whole nother thing. And then eccentric failure. And because when you're doing that, you are so tired that you can't recover in 2 or 3 days and train again, right? But again, we've got this triangle of frequency, intensity, and volume, pick 2. But they were just taking it to a further, they're like, oh, since I'm training less frequently, I need to do even more intensity. And then they're recovering less. And then and it just became this feed-forward cycle of stupid. The Hardgainer people did the same thing, right? So Hardgainer philosophy, without getting into a whole separate, that was another reaction to the volume work of the day, right, of the 80s, started by Stuart McRobert. But Hardgainer philosophy originally, was really just a return to pre-steroid era bodybuilding. Moderate volumes, focus on progressive overload. Stuart was the one that said, look, if as a natural, you can bench the 3-4-5, 300-pound bench, 400-pound squat, 500-pound deadlift for reps at 180, you'll be as big as you're going to be. He's not wrong. Now, people misinterpreted that completely. There's a boring article on my website about how wrong what he said and what they heard were totally wrong things. And even as people are like, oh, those aren't big numbers. I'm like, okay, how many legitimate 315-pound benches have you seen by someone weighing 180 pounds in any commercial gym? And the answer is usually 0. How many legitimate 405 squats have you ever seen below parallel by someone weighing 180 for reps? And the answer is 0. How many 500-pound deadlifts, 235 kilos, whatever that works out to, you ever seen in a commercial gym? Not an elite powerlifting gym. I mean, the average, the answer is 0. So all you go that's not, elite powerlifting. I don't care. That's not who he was talking about. It's why would you limit yourself? I'm he didn't say that was an upper limit. He said that as a goal. And if you get there, you'll be as big as just like Jones had said 20 years earlier. And I still haven't ever seen it in 30 years, or not often. I've seen guys that weigh 300 pounds, bench 305 for reps, 315 for reps. 180 pounds with legitimate non-bouncing form? No, 0.
We covered this actually in the very first podcast we did.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's reality.
When we discussed the natty limit.
Yeah. So that was kind of Stewart's thing. Very reasonable, moderate volumes. But then Hardgainer, as the magazine continued, it just got stupider as people tried to out Hardgainer one another. I remember they would start the article, I'm the biggest Hardgainer on the planet. I can only do one all-out set to failure every 2 weeks. but I don't grow because I'm a hard gainer. Like, no, you don't grow because your training is shit. But like what started as a very reasonable message. Don't do 1 million sets of pumping work. Do a moderate volume focusing on progressive overload. The message got garbled over a 10-year span, and it just got stupid. And HIT went through the same thing. Okay, so 2000s, we're telling these HIT guys, look, maybe by doing so much intensity in these workouts, by taking yourself so far in, which is forcing you to take so much longer between workouts, you're actually doing more harm than good. And they never accepted that. Until Doug McGuff showed up. Doug McGuff wrote this book called Body by Science that does not contain an iota of accurate scientific evidence. Because you got to put that in your
that sounds
title.
familiar.
So McGuff became the new HIT guru. And he had this crazy idea that while HIT was good, while going to failure was good, you would make better progress if you did a less than maximal workout every other training session so that you could train more frequently. Wow. It's exactly what we're telling them the whole time. So rather than one all-out set every 10 days, they would do one, whatever, their HIT workout, and then 4 or 5 days later, they'd go do a, not easy, but a so suddenly their frequency went to once every 5th day, and suddenly they started gaining again. But they needed a new guru to tell them that. And then somehow they decided that HIT included periodization. I don't remember how that logical argument went, but somehow they went from periodization as BS to, oh no, HIT is just a form of periodization, because I don't remember that well enough. But that was kind of like the next, almost a de-evolution. It almost took the message of Jones and Mentzer and Dorian and took a step backwards by acknowledging that, yeah, this is great, but if you're training so infrequently and realistically don't have anabolics like Dorian did, I know people have made once a week training work. I don't think it's optimal in the majority of cases, but this was an example. Yeah, when your training frequency gets stretched out too far as a natural, you make less gains, but having that second submaximal workout more frequently, amazing stuff. So that's, if there's been any new developments since then, I don't really know. That was the 2000, I think the 2010s or something. Let me see when Body by Science got published.
We've seen a resurgence post TikTok in the popularity of Mike Mentzer's heavy duty training methodology.
But see, that's been going on for decades. It's true of diets too. Things
Pendulum.
come in. Yeah, things come so back, you go way back. Right. So in the 60s, it was everybody's like, carbs and fats are bad because Ansel Keys. Then Atkins came along and low carb was in. And then back in the 80s, that's when it went back to very super low fat, high carbs. In the 90s, it was the zone, and it was moderate fat, moderate carbs, moderate protein. And then we went back to cyclical keto diets in the late 90s with Body Opus and the anabolic diet in my book. And then we went back, I forget what happened in the 2000s, but it's just you could see this pendulum every few years. Now, I don't think it's quite as distinct. Now we're at the point
it's not so much demonizing macronutrients as much as it is particular food items. For instance, you'll see, there's the anti-seed oil folks. There are the anti-seed oil folks, and then there are the anti-meat folks, and so it goes.
Yeah, that's been around as part of this. But if you're looking at global diet trends, it tends to kind of go through those. And then once the internet got established, I didn't see quite as much variation, because every little group could create their own little cloistered, we've got HIT Facebook groups, and we've got paleo Facebook groups, and we got that they could I didn't see quite as much variation as I used to, just because of the nature of the internet. But with training, you're still, I guarantee you the HIT guys are in their little HIT groups that they're not paying any attention to this. But if you're looking at the mainstream fitness industry, which, was websites and Facebook and then YouTube and Instagram and I guess now TikTok, all we're seeing is like, okay, 52 sets was huge volumes. Brad's paper came out. It was all volume. Then everybody walked it back and was like, you're doing too much volume. And then the next paper came out and now you're doing tons of volume. And then suddenly people were like, okay, we need to go back to heavy duty Mentzer, and it'll get trendy probably because someone big is using, some fitness influencer is like, I'm a Mentzerite and I use heavy duty and I'm big. And then that'll become trendy and people do that for a little while. And then somebody else will come through that uses volume training. And that's just been the nature of it as long as I can remember. But it does move in trends, absolutely, because it filters through my Facebook group every 5 or 6 months. And so I'll be like, what do you think about heavy duty? I go, same thing I thought about it 10 years ago. Just no. Like, it has its place, like whatever. It's a matter of context and application and what you're talking about. But that was actually another thing I should have mentioned with the HIT guys. Another one of their beliefs, which is provably wrong. They would state that training to failure is required for growth. That is provably false. Because if I can find one person who's ever grown muscle without training to failure, that disproves that statement. Now, is training to failure optimal for stimulating growth? Now, that's a different question, which has a very complicated answer, which we've talked about elsewhere. I know, but that was, again, one of their arguments. They went from what is a reasonable statement.
Yeah, I've got a failure video in the pipeline.
Yeah, right. But it's like, is it optimal? Well, that depends. What are we talking about? What kind of volumes? What kind of frequencies? What kind of, it's too many variables. But is it required? But clearly not. That is a provably disprovable statement. It's a provably incorrect statement because you only need one exception, and there's too many of them. So, like I said, what's going on in the HIT world, if there's any new groups or developments, I'm not aware of it, but I must say I've been kind of out of the loop. And at this point, I don't know what other variations really could exist. There's only so many ways to program any type of training, but it was always predicated on the difficulty is more important than the amount done. And to a first approximation, I don't disagree with that, right? You can do 30 piss-ass sets and not get a stimulus. And you can do 2 all-out sets and get a stimulus. Does that mean 2 all-out sets is better than 6 at 2 reps in reserve? That's a different question. And that has a much more complicated answer because that's it depends. If you're on drugs, yeah, volume works. So does intensity. So does not training. I mean, that changes the game completely. But if we're talking about naturals, it's more than a simple answer, but people like simple answers. So yeah, so we started with Arthur Jonesian, which is pretty moderate volume frequency. Mentzer made it a little bit more extreme. I dare say Dorian walked it back a little bit because he believed in more exercises. And then we got into the internet where it just got progressively dumber. Because
as for Mentzer, like the great philosopher Wittgenstein, there's the kind of early Mentzer and the late Mentzer.
Right, yes.
And their approaches to lifting were vastly different. Wasn't it that toward the end, Mentzer was arguing, you recounted one of his later claims, which was that you could reach your genetic limit in 6 months, but he's also stated, I believe, that one maximal isometric every fortnight.
I seem to I swear I read that at one point he was recommending basically a maximal isometric into a controlled eccentric very infrequently. But see, here's the thing, and I didn't realize this until I watched these videos by this guy, which is that some of that may have been John Little writing for him. So I do not want to go on record as saying that Mentzer, because again, it was one of Mentzer's last books, but Mentzer didn't finish it himself because he passed away. So I may be, and actually when I was Googling before we got on, and about something about, I forget what it was specifically about Mentzer, and some guy was like, yes, I implemented this idea of I've got my people just doing, extended isometric holds. for 8 seconds and then doing a controlled eccentric. I guess the idea being to get like maximal contraction to fatigue and then an eccentric. And yes, the frequencies just kept getting lower and lower and lower and lower. Because obviously if less is better and less frequent is better, well, then the least that you can do and the less, that's why I haven't trained in 10 years. And I figure I'm going to take the Olympia in like 2 of them. I have done 0 training for over 10 years. That's the lowest volume and the lowest frequency of training I can actually do. So I figure the gains are coming. Well,
as we know, it's either you do a workout once every picosecond or once every infinity.
Yes, there are no other options in terms of making progress. Because if, I mean, again, you could apply the same logic. If doing less is better than doing the least, doing the least, actually find a way to do negative training, like not eccentric training. Like what is the opposite of working out? Like what is inverse training? Because obviously that's the least you can do. Or, actually I just multiply my set count by I. So I'll just drop that there. Anybody who gets it gets it, and anybody who doesn't, look it up.
I implore folks to look it up.
That's funny. Stealing.
Had you any sort of concluding?
I mean, honestly, no. Like, I think what the goal of this was to sort of look at the history of HIT from where it started, which was Jones as an iconoclast, to how it developed and just became more and more and more extreme, and in my opinion, more and more and more stupid over the years. Because again, it's just it became a logical exercise. Jones said that doing less at a higher intensity is better than doing more at a lower intensity. Okay. Contextually, I can agree with that for naturals. We can quibble about the numbers, but I can agree with that, contextually. But then it became the race to who can do the least frequently. Because people just, let's take this to its logical end extreme. And I think if you look at some of the earlier iterations, absolutely, they'd be better for most people than the piss ass following the fitness industry BS that they're doing. Even if for no other reason. So Poliquin once wrote this thing. Poliquin was very anti-HIT, because of course he was. And he would say, because you get these people and they were doing volume training, typical Arnold stuff. And then they would switch, they would flip-flop to HIT, and they would make great gains for like 6 weeks. And he would be like, yeah, you make gains for 6 weeks, but then you stop because you're not changing the training, which I don't agree with necessarily, but I think it depends on what they were doing. I mean, you could just as easily argue, oh, they're just getting delayed adaptations from the previous block. They're just doing a tapering block. And there would probably be some elements of truth to that as well. But it's also like what version, you see those ideas. My favorite trite statement in the fitness industry. The best training is the one you're not currently doing, which is
I love that statement.
The dumbest shit. I made a meme one time. I'm like, well, by that logic, and if you're in the gym right now, the training you're doing is not the best training, and you should change your training to the training that you're not doing. But now the best training is the training you're not doing, so you need to change your training again. Like, why not, again, apply that logically during the workout?
Do you think there's a charitable interpretation?
No, it's me. That is an argument. That's me just being obnoxious, because that's what I get paid for. That is me making an argument some extreme. It's like, which is that if the best training is the one you're not currently doing, then you should be changing your training. And every time you change your training, you need to change your training, and you should do that during the workout to make a point. Now, I do see what it's getting at, which is that, because there's also this idea that I both see the point and I agree with and don't agree with, depending on how you want to look at it, which is that you do frequently see people like, okay, they did volume, and then for whatever reason, they switch to a higher intensity, lower volume, and frequently they start getting results again. And then that stops working, and they switch back to volume. Now, I think we can make an argument for that based on the fact that there are multiple physiological systems that have to adapt. I mean, even with my own work, even since the 2000s, I was like, look, every 3 hypertrophy blocks do a short maximal strength block, because this is building the physical components. This will top up the nervous system. and allow you to use heavier weights when you go back to volume. So I think there is some, I understand, there is some rationale to it, in the sense of if you're running into a roadblock, right? If one physiological system has become limiting, whatever it may be, and you happen to switch to a different training that happens to develop that point, then yes, that's where I think where that idea comes from. Like, oh, when I changed my training from this to this, but frequently people are changing from, frequently the HIT thing, people were doing ridiculous bodybuilding stuff. Well, I was doing 30 sets per muscle group, and then I changed to HIT and I started making gains. HIT is only better by comparison. It's like when people go, oh yeah, I switched to paleo and I feel great. Well, what were you eating beforehand? Oh, the standard Western diet. I go, it's not so much that paleo is better or best. It's just better than what you were doing. That doesn't mean it's, again, there's a happy medium. If somebody comes from dumb bodybuilding training, i.e. listening to most of what's written in the fitness industry, and switches to heavy duty or HIT or one of those, yeah, of course they're going to make better gains. Not so much because this is better as this was terrible. And again, frequently there's a happy middle, but then they become absolute cultists. HIT is because that's when I started making gains. Well, how many gains have you made in the last 3 months? Well, none, but that's just genetics. Cool. It's the same argument as telling someone who's like, Atkins is the best. I lost so much weight. I go, well, how much weight have you lost in the last 6 months? None. Well, then it's clearly not working. Well, and I go, that's because calories matter. No. Atkins, calories doesn't matter. I go, well, then why aren't you losing weight? Oh, genetics. All right, cool. Cool story. I'm moving on. Right? Like but it's hard to make that. People can't see that once they've sort of, and then whatever, then the HIT guy, they see the new TikToker and go, oh, I'm going to change my training to this. Oh, I'm making gains again. Cool. This is the new best way of training. So but that's just human nature. And that's true of all things, to one degree or another. So, yeah, so it's not, I don't know that we're just actually trying to make a point so much as tracing the history. And the one thing I would say,
yeah,
people get nothing else out of this. And again, this was my point of those videos I did about what failure is. Something Arthur Jones famously once said. And I think there is some truth to this. And I've said this in a slightly different context. Training to failure is a learned skill. Truly training to limits is a skill. Now we can quibble, does anyone ever truly could you maybe do more? We know there's all the stories about moms who pull car, all that kind of stuff that goes on and crazy ideas, meth heads and PCP, and you get PCP strength or whatever. But Arthur Jones once said, if you thought you were at muscular failure and I were to point a gun at you and say, get another rep or I pull the trigger, you'll get another rep. And I don't know if I would agree with that completely, but it's more the point he's trying to make. What most people think is truly limits is probably not. Beginners more so, it can be learned. When I coach people, they have to learn how to push harder and learn that they have, when they think they're done, they may have a little bit more. And that's a learned skill. And arguably one of the biggest benefits of this style of training, even if it's just for a short block, even if it's for some short period of time in your career, where you've only got one set, where you're not pacing yourself psychologically, where you're not thinking about, I've got 5 more sets of this, I need to hold back, is to learn what 0 reps in reserve. And I'm changing terminology because people can use the F word and play lots of cute little linguistic games with it. Because I defined it very carefully in my video. Let's switch to 0 reps in reserve. HIT would mean training to the point of 0 reps in reserve, which means you cannot physically complete another full range repetition no matter how much effort. That's what 0 reps in reserve is. One means you get 1 more and then be unable to complete the repetition. Most people have no clue what 0 reps in reserve is. I don't care what they think. I'm sure there's people listening who go, I'm the exception, to which I say, send me the video. Maybe you are, but statistically speaking, you're not. Because whenever I seem to put up one of my videos showing what it looks like, because I'm good at intensity, they go, wow, I thought I was at 0 reps in reserve and I'm nowhere close. And then they go, I went to the gym and put 40 pounds on the bar and did 7 more reps. I'm like, yeah, where you thought 0 reps. Doing this style of training. And it is. There is a psychological component to this. Absolutely. I did a consultation with just recently, and we were talking about volumes, and they didn't want to be in the gym long, and we were like, fine, we'll program, 3 to 4, pretty much all out sets, and they're good at that and stuff. And I'm like, look, big picture stuff, you can do 4 sets of 1 exercise, 2 sets of 2 exercises, 1 set of 4 exercises. I don't give a damn, right? It's big picture stuff as long as you pick your exercises relatively reasonably. But I have heard people say, and I think there's some logic to this. Again, it goes to even if you're doing 4 total sets, right? Like let's say you're doing 4 sets of a chest press. Part of your brain will be like, well, I've got this set, but I've still got 3 more to go. So I better not wreck myself on the first set. But if I now say, okay, we're going to do 2 sets of pec deck and 2 sets of chest press, you're probably more likely to push yourself because, oh, well, I've only got 1. You're only thinking in terms of the exercise. But if I go, okay, you're going to do 1 set of pec deck, 1 set of chest press, 1 set of incline flies, and 1 set of incline bench press, rather than seeing that as 4 set, you'll just see that as 1 set, 1 set, 1 set, 1 set. And you're probably going to be more likely to be able to push to true limits because the second exercise is seen, it's distinct. Yes, it's the same workout, but it's a separate exercise. I can give my all, and I think that's probably part of where Dorian was coming from. Whether it might be in blood and guts, but it was like, yeah, you're not going to do 4 all-out sets to failure of the same exercise, but you can do 1 all-out set of 4 different exercises. From the standpoint, again, I'm not saying train like that forever, but as a function of learning how to do it, this type of training can absolutely be beneficial, even if you never train like that again. Even if you prefer to do multiple sets at 3 reps in reserve until you know what 0 is, like truly going until the bar will not move. Wouldn't recommend the gun thing that Arthur Jones recommended. I mean, it would probably work, but I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, Texas is open carry, but actually, let's just not go down that road. It will be a good way to learn. Like, do that for 4 to 6 weeks, and you might be stunned at how much you're actually leaving in the tank, so that when you go back to more traditional training, if you choose to, you actually know what 2 reps for reserve is. Like I said, I can guarantee most people listening to this, they think they do, but they don't. And I know that for a fact because when I told people who were complaining to me that, F you, Lyle, Mike Israetel, and I said, well, send me a video proving me wrong, and I got 0 of them. So clearly they knew I was right because they would have proven me wrong given the opportunity. So it has its place. Like I said, you can also use this frequently, and again, I program this with consultations sometimes. It's a great way, like especially rest pause. If you've got exercises at the end that you just don't give a crap about, for some reason I seem to consult with a lot of people who are like, I don't want to do arm training. I'm like, just do a set or 2 rather than giving them multiple sets at slightly submaximal levels. Like, just do 1 or 2 sets to failure and go the hell home, or do a dog crap set. Like, it's a great way to just bust out piddly stuff on, safer isolation exercises just to save time. Like, so I gave that example of that workout that I might use with, power lifter, just someone like, a power builder or whatever the hell that'll come back into, that'll become trendy here before too long. But I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to have someone barbell bench 4 to 6 sets of 5 at 85%, as an example, 4 to 6 sets of 4 to 6 sets, whatever you said. But I might have them do, 3 by 3, maybe even 6 by 3 at 85% to improve their bench. And then I'll do some donkey work. I'll do, a chest press exercise for 3 to 4 sets of 6 to 8. And then then I'll just do 2 sets of pec deck, burn them out, send them the hell home. There's nothing that says it can't be a combination. You just can't do both. You can't, years ago, I got some email by someone. Again, I was very much into the lower volume Hardgainer type stuff, and I'm clearly a little bit more. That was young me. This is old me. It has its place, and again, most people would probably benefit from less volume and more intensity. I was actually blown away a bunch of years ago. Brett Contreras, of all people, said people need to do less volume and more intensity, and I'm like, good God. When Brett Contreras is the voice of reason in this industry, we are in bizarro world, right? This is when everybody was pushing Brad's volume paper, and Brett was actually the voice of reason. But he's not. I don't disagree with that. But I was like, yeah, consider some of this Hardgainer stuff. And he goes, oh, yeah, I'm going to combine that with the stuff in Arnold's Education of a Bodybuilder. I go, you can't. Something people, I think, miss when they look at these different systems of training, whether it's HIT, whether it's dog crap, whether it's HST, whether it, like whatever it is, or Arnold style, whatever it is, they are consistent within themselves in terms of the volume, frequency, intensity, and exercise choices that they make. They are not consistent generally with other systems, right? Dog crap, which is rest pause to failure, trades volume for intensity. You don't do a lot of sets. You do 2 work sets per muscle and then a stretch. And I've never even done that. But they're rest pause sets. Blades Meyer reps is similar, but different and more boring. HST, hypertrophy specific training, that nobody listening to this has ever heard of. Brian Haycock.
Brian Haycock.
Yeah. Brian Haycock back in the 2000s. His book, any day now. I'm sure 2 more weeks. I'm sure we're going to get it anytime now. It had you training full body, 3 days a week, low volume, but you started very submaximally and only had a maximal workout every 2 weeks. It traded frequency for intensity, right? My generic bulking routine splits the middle in terms of volumes, twice a week, upper, lower, generally. Moderate amount of sets, a little bit down from failure. Arnold, very high volume, further away from failure, lower frequency. Each of these systems is consistent within themselves because of the relationships between these variables. So when this guy said, oh, I'm going to combine Hardgainer ideas with volume ideas, like, no. Don't. You will break. It's one or the other, right? If you're going to do high intensity, you must do low volume. If you want to do low volumes or only can do low volumes, it better be high intensity. If you want to do lower intensity, you have to do higher volumes to make up for it. Because 2 sets at 7 reps in reserve isn't going to get anybody anywhere without drugs. 20 sets at 7 reps, well, still won't get you anywhere, but you see my point. So within all these systems, they're consistent with one another. So this can be great, but you can combine them to a limited degree. Said, want to do one all-out set of an isolation movement as a finisher for a muscle group? Cool. Don't do it on everything. You can do submaximal work on other stuff, whatever. So I trained Sumi, basically, was, singles in the power lifts at 90%, 85 to 90%, hard, but not grindy. Then she would do assistance work, triples, with 1 really top hard set, and then 5 pretty hard sets for hypertrophy work. So it was a combination of different approaches.
3 times a week.
Right, but that was all. But also because of the frequency, I did have to worry about neuromuscular fatigue. So the volume, the hypertrophy work, the volume was there, but it was like 5 work sets, just 5 sets across. But it wasn't ever. They were hard, but they weren't a grinding failure because she had to do it again. Now I wouldn't do that for hypertrophy for most people. Now that she's training more for that, she trains each muscle group twice a week for higher volumes. That was specific to her powerlifting training. The point simply being is that interaction, when people talk about this in this industry, oh, do 52 sets, do this intensity, do that intensity, do this frequency. You cannot discuss that outside of the other variables because they are not independent. Like with all the dumb volume studies, what gets left out is they're only doing 1 muscle group for like 8 weeks at a time. Great. So they built them up to 52 sets. Fantastic. There's 8 other muscle groups. People are like, you need to do 52 sets for growth. Well, you've left out a very important point then, haven't you? They only did 1 muscle group. They said that in the study. Why didn't you say it on Instagram, Milo? So HIT is consistent within itself, and within reason, it can be effective. And taken to the dumb extreme, it is not.
So overall, you have a more sympathetic view toward HIT than many others in the fitness industry.
Yeah, but I wonder how much of that is them. Well, I think it's two things. I think one, they're responding to a very specific style and type of HIT that's being presented because they don't know the history of it. Like, yeah, would I recommend super slow? Well, only if you're hurt. Other than that,
yeah. So whereas you have a broader view, they interpret it more narrowly.
Right. But I think there's a bigger issue. And I've seen this in multiple other things. For example, many people dislike keto diets, very low carbohydrate diets, because they don't like the zealots who proselytize about them. And I said, that has nothing to do with the diet. The people, the cultists, have nothing to do with the physiology of the diet itself.
Yeah, it's a sort
And
of
the
guilt by
reality-
association thing.
Right. But they're like, well, I don't like, I don't like the keto cultists. I don't like them either. That has nothing to do with anything. That has nothing to do with the validity or not of ketogenic diets. Nothing. And the reality, the HIT people, I think more so than some other groups, like you don't by and large, in my experience, see periodization people going around telling everyone they should do periodization and that you're dumb if not, unless you get into a discussion with them. The HIT guys, they're like, or they were at one point, they're the Jehovah's Witnesses of the training world.